Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. When I moved my family to the outskirts of San Antonio, we thought we'd found the perfect place to raise our kids. The house was affordable, the neighborhood was quiet, and we had plenty of space for our growing family. But sometimes, what seems like a blessing can turn into something much darker. The trouble started about a month after we moved in. My daughter Emma, who was 12 at the time, started complaining about strange sounds at night. She said she could hear a cat crying above her bedroom, somewhere on the roof. At first, I didn't think much of it. We lived in Texas, after all, and stray cats were common. But Emma insisted it wasn't a normal cat sound. It was more like crying, like someone in pain. The sounds would start around midnight and continue until dawn. Emma would come to our bedroom in tears, saying the crying was so loud and so sad that it made her feel sick to her stomach. She described it as the most heartbreaking sound she'd ever heard, like someone had lost everything they'd ever loved. My wife, Maria, tried to comfort Emma, telling her it was probably just a stray cat that would move on eventually. But as the nights went on, the crying seemed to get louder and more desperate. Emma wasn't sleeping, and her grades at school were starting to suffer. She was becoming withdrawn and jumpy, constantly looking over her shoulder during the day. After 2 weeks of this, I decided I'd had enough. I'm a practical man, and I wasn't going to let some stray cat terrorize my daughter. I had a hunting rifle that I kept locked in the closet for home protection, and I figured I'd just go up on the roof and scare the animal away. Problem solved. I decided to wait until the crying started, so I'd know exactly where to find it. Around 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, I climbed up onto the roof with my rifle and a flashlight. The neighborhood was quiet, and I could see clearly in all directions. Our house was one of the taller ones on the block, so I had a good view of the surrounding area. I waited for almost an hour, scanning the rooftop for any sign of movement. Nothing. No cat, no crying, no sounds at all except for the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I was starting to think Emma had imagined the whole thing, or maybe the cat had finally moved on. But then, around 3 in the morning, I heard it. Not on my roof, but coming from the vacant lot next to our house. It wasn't a cat at all. It was a woman's voice, low and mournful, like someone singing a lullaby through tears. I crept to the edge of the roof and looked down into the lot. There, standing among the tall weeds and debris, was a woman. She was unusually tall and thin, with long black hair that reached almost to her waist. Her hair hung in front of her face like a curtain, completely obscuring her features. She was wearing what looked like a long white dress, or nightgown, that seemed to glow in the moonlight. At first, I thought it might be Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who lived on the other side of the lot. Maybe she was sleepwalking or having some kind of episode. But as I watched more carefully, I realized this woman was much taller than Mrs. Rodriguez, and much younger from what I could see of her posture. The woman was swaying slightly as she sang, her arms hanging limply at her sides. There was something deeply unsettling about her posture. She was too still, too rigid, like a mannequin that had been posed rather than a living person. I raised my rifle and aimed it in her direction, not intending to shoot, but wanting to get her attention. Maybe if I called out to her, she'd realize she was disturbing the neighborhood and move along. But before I could say anything, her singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. It was like the entire world had suddenly held its breath. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. I kept my rifle trained on her, waiting to see what she would do next. That's when I heard it, the same mournful crying. But now it was coming from directly behind me. The sound was so close, I could feel the vibration in my chest, as if someone were standing right next to me on the roof. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, expecting to see the woman somehow standing behind me, but there was nothing there. Just the empty rooftop and the dark sky above. When I turned back to look at the lot, the woman was gone, completely vanished, as if she'd never been there at all. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the area with my flashlight, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. The lot was empty, except for the usual debris and weeds. There was nowhere for someone to hide, nowhere for them to have gone so quickly. A chill ran down my spine, and every instinct I had was telling me to get off that roof and get back inside. I'd grown up hearing stories about spirits and supernatural encounters, but I'd never believed them. I was a rational man, a man of science and facts. But what I just witnessed defied all logic. I climbed down from the roof as quietly as I could, my hands shaking as I put away my rifle. When I got inside, Maria was waiting for me in the hallway. "Did you find it?" she asked. "Did you scare away the cat?" I looked at her for a moment, trying to decide how much to tell her. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I tell her that whatever was haunting our daughter wasn't a cat at all, but something far more disturbing? "Yeah," I said finally, "I think I took care of it." And strangely enough, I had. From that night forward, Emma never heard the crying again. She started sleeping through the night, and her personality slowly returned to normal. Whatever the woman in the lot had been, whatever she'd wanted, she seemed to have gotten it. But I never forgot that night on the roof. I never forgot the sight of that tall, thin figure standing in the weeds, or the sound of her voice right behind me when I knew she was nowhere near. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still find myself listening for that mournful crying, wondering if she might come back. I never told Emma what I really saw that night. How could I? Some things are better left buried, some mysteries are better left unsolved. But every now and then, when I'm driving past that vacant lot, I slow down and take a look, just to make sure it's still empty, just to make sure she's not standing there again, waiting for someone else to hear her cry. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. This is a story that has haunted my family for over 40 years. A tale of jealousy, revenge, and supernatural forces that I'm still trying to understand. It begins with my grandmother, Alina, and the choices she made as a young woman that would affect generations of women in our family. My grandmother was born in a small town in New Mexico in 1938. She was beautiful, spirited, and full of life, the kind of woman who turned heads wherever she went. When she was 19, she fell in love with a man named Marcus, a charming businessman who seemed to offer her everything she'd ever dreamed of. The problem was that Marcus was already married. At first, my grandmother didn't know about his wife. Marcus told her he was single, that he was looking for a woman to share his life with. By the time she discovered the truth, she was already pregnant with her first child, my Aunt Rosa. Marcus's wife, Catherine, was a wealthy woman from an influential family in Santa Fe. She had connections, money, and power, everything my grandmother lacked. When Catherine discovered her husband's affair, she was consumed with rage and jealousy. She couldn't divorce Marcus without losing her social standing, but she couldn't bear the thought of him having a family with another woman. So she turned to darker methods of revenge. My grandmother ended up having 3 daughters with Marcus: Rosa, Lucia, and my mother, Carmen. Each birth made Catherine more furious, more determined to destroy the woman who had stolen her husband's heart. Marcus, torn between his 2 lives, eventually abandoned my grandmother and her daughters, leaving them to fend for themselves in a small adobe house on the outskirts of town. But Catherine's revenge was just beginning. When my grandmother's oldest daughter, Rosa, was just 10 weeks old, something terrible happened. My grandmother had been exhausted from caring for the baby alone, and she fell into a deep sleep one afternoon. She woke to find a dark figure standing over the baby's cradle. The figure was tall and imposing, with eyes that seemed to burn with hatred. It reached down and lifted baby Rosa from her crib, cradling her in arms that felt like ice. My grandmother later described the entity as having a woman's face, but distorted and filled with malice. She knew immediately that this wasn't a natural intruder. It was something supernatural, something that had been sent to harm her family. Without hesitation, my grandmother sprang into action. She was a devout Catholic who always kept blessed items nearby for protection. She grabbed a pair of metal scissors from her sewing kit and hurled them at the dark figure. "Give me back my baby," she screamed, lunging forward to snatch Rosa from the entity's grasp. The moment the blessed metal touched the creature, it let out a horrible shriek and vanished into thin air. But the damage was already done. Little Rosa had turned completely pale, as if her life force had been partially drained. Her breathing was shallow, and she felt cold to the touch. My grandmother wrapped the baby and ran to the main house where her parents lived. When they saw the state Rosa was in, they immediately called for Esperanza, a local curandera known for her ability to combat supernatural afflictions. Esperanza took one look at the baby and nodded grimly. "Someone has sent death itself after this child," she said. "This is not a natural illness. This is a curse, placed by someone with a deep hatred in their heart." The curandera prepared special teas made from herbs that grew wild in the desert: yerba buena, ruda, and albahaca. She also performed 2 cleansing rituals, using items that belonged to Marcus to create a protective barrier around the baby. According to tradition, clothing and personal effects from the father carry powerful energy that can shield his children from harm. For hours, Esperanza worked to remove the spiritual contamination from Rosa's tiny body. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, the baby's color returned to normal, and she began to breathe easily again. The immediate crisis had passed, but Esperanza warned that this was only the beginning. "Whoever did this will not stop with one attempt," she said solemnly. "They want to destroy this family line, and they will keep trying until they succeed, or until you find a way to break the curse." When my grandmother's second daughter, Lucia, was born 2 years later, the supernatural attacks continued, though they were less direct. My grandmother would see dark shadows moving through the house at night, and once, a black cat appeared in the baby's room and spoke to her in a human voice. "All the women in this family are cursed," the cat said in a voice that sounded eerily like Catherine's. "Your daughters will never know peace, and neither will their daughters after them." Lucia was fortunate. She suffered only minor afflictions that were easily treated with traditional remedies. But it was my mother, Carmen, who bore the brunt of the supernatural assault. From the time she was 2 years old, my mother experienced a series of mysterious illnesses and accidents that defied medical explanation. Her stomach would swell to enormous proportions, and doctors said her organs were literally rotting from the inside. She required 12 separate healing sessions with different curanderas before the condition was finally resolved. Throughout her childhood and teenage years, my mother was plagued by spider bites that would become infected and refuse to heal. She was bitten by black widows, brown recluses, and other venomous spiders with alarming frequency. It was as if the creatures were drawn to her, as if something was calling them to attack. When she was 16, my mother was in a serious car accident that should have killed her. A drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the passenger side of the car where she was sitting. She survived, but her leg was badly injured, and she walked with a limp for months afterward. Each incident seemed designed to either kill her or weaken her enough that she couldn't have children of her own. But my mother was strong, stronger than the forces working against her. She survived everything that was thrown at her, and eventually she had 2 children, my brother Miguel and me. The pattern became clear as our family grew. In every generation, the women faced constant threats, accidents, illnesses, financial problems, and relationship difficulties that seemed to come from nowhere. We were always struggling, always fighting against forces that seemed determined to keep us down. My aunts Rosa and Lucia each had children of their own, and their daughters faced the same challenges. Rosa's daughter, Patricia, was in 3 separate car accidents before she turned 25. Lucia's daughter, Monica, developed a rare autoimmune disease that doctors couldn't properly diagnose or treat. Meanwhile, the men in our family lived relatively normal lives. My brother Miguel has never had a serious illness or accident. My male cousins have successful careers and stable relationships. It's as if the curse specifically targets the women, generation after generation. As an adult, I decided to investigate our family's history more thoroughly. I spoke with elderly relatives, researched local records, and even tracked down people who had known Catherine. What I discovered confirmed my grandmother's suspicions. Catherine had indeed consulted with practitioners of dark magic after discovering Marcus's affair. Multiple sources told me that she had paid substantial sums to have curses placed on my grandmother and her descendants. She wanted to ensure that the women of our family would never know happiness, would never be able to build the kind of life she felt my grandmother had stolen from her. The curse was specifically designed to affect only the female line. The men would be spared so they could witness the suffering of their mothers, sisters, and daughters, adding psychological torment to the supernatural attacks. I also learned that Catherine had died in 1985, but her death didn't end the curse. According to the practitioners I consulted, curses of this magnitude can persist for generations, fed by the original hatred, and reinforced by each new tragedy that befalls the family. Today, I have a daughter of my own, and I watch her constantly for signs that the curse is still active. So far, she's been healthy and happy, but she's still young. I've had multiple cleansing ceremonies performed, and I keep blessed objects throughout our house. I've consulted with curanderas, priests, and even modern therapists who specialize in generational trauma. Some people tell me that what our family has experienced is simply bad luck, or the result of poverty and limited access to health care. They say that supernatural curses don't exist, that I'm looking for mystical explanations for natural phenomena. But I know what I've seen. I know the pattern that has repeated itself in our family for over 4 decades. I know that something unnatural has been working against us, something that goes beyond coincidence or circumstance. Whether you call it a curse, generational trauma, or simply the long-reaching effects of one woman's hatred, the impact on our family has been real and devastating. We've lost too many opportunities, faced too many obstacles, and endured too much suffering for it to be purely random. But we've also survived. Despite everything that has been thrown at us, the women in my family have persevered. We've raised children, built careers, and found love in the midst of chaos. We've learned to be strong, to support each other, and to fight against forces that seek to destroy us. Maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that even in the face of supernatural opposition, human resilience and love can prevail. The curse may still be with us, but we're still here, still fighting, still refusing to be broken by the hatred of someone who died decades ago. My daughter represents a new generation, a chance to break the cycle once and for all. I'm determined to give her every protection I can, both spiritual and practical. And if the curse does try to claim her, it will have to go through me first. Because some bonds are stronger than any curse. The bond between a mother and her child, the bond between sisters facing adversity together, and the bond that connects all the women in our family across time and space. We are survivors, and we will continue to survive, no matter what forces try to stop us. "10 years ago, I was making my living as a mariachi in the small border town of Laredo, Texas. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills and allowed me to share my love of music with people during their most important moments. I'd play at weddings, quinceañeras, anniversaries, and sometimes funerals. The life of a freelance mariachi is unpredictable. Some days you're booked solid, and some days you're standing outside restaurants and bars, hoping someone will pay you to play a song or two. I'd learned to take work wherever I could find it, regardless of the circumstances. It was November 1st, Dia de los Muertos, when this story takes place. I'd been having a slow day, playing outside the cathedral in the center of town, when the sun began to set. The Day of the Dead is always a melancholy time, when families gather to remember their loved ones who have passed on. The whole town takes on a different atmosphere, more reverent, more connected to the spirit world. I was packing up my guitar case when an elderly gentleman approached me. He was well dressed in a black suit, with silver hair and kind eyes. He spoke with a slight accent, but his English was perfect. "Excuse me, senor," he said politely. "I wonder if you might be available for a private performance this evening." I looked at him more carefully. He seemed respectable enough, and I could use the money. "What kind of performance are you looking for?" My family and I would like to honor a recently departed loved one at the cemetery. We'd like you to play some traditional songs, something to help us say goodbye properly." The request didn't strike me as unusual. Many families hire musicians to play at gravesites, especially on Dia de los Muertos. It's a beautiful tradition that helps celebrate the life of the deceased rather than just mourning their death. "I'd be happy to help," I replied. "What time and where should I meet you? If you could follow me now, that would be perfect." The rest of my family is already waiting at San Fernando Cemetery. I gathered my equipment and followed him through the winding streets of Old Laredo. The cemetery was about a 15-minute walk from the cathedral, and as we walked, the man told me about his family's loss. He spoke of their loved one with great tenderness, describing how much their music had meant to them in life. When we arrived at the cemetery, I saw 4 other people waiting by a fresh grave site. There were 3 women and 2 men, all dressed in formal black attire. The women wore black dresses with delicate veils that covered their faces, while the men wore broad-brimmed hats that cast shadows over their features. Despite the formal dress, there was something timeless about their appearance, as if they'd stepped out of an old photograph. The grave they stood around was indeed fresh. The earth was still loose, and the headstone looked newly placed. Fresh flowers were arranged around the site, and I could smell the sweet scent of marigolds, traditional for Day of the Dead celebrations. "Thank you for coming," one of the women said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'd like you to play some of our loved ones' favorite songs." They requested several traditional pieces: Amor Eterno, Hermoso Cariño, and Las Golondrinas. These were songs of love and loss, songs that spoke to the heart about eternal bonds that death cannot break. As I began to play, I noticed the family's reaction was immediate and intense. From the very first notes, they began to sway and weep. The women knelt beside the grave, their sobs growing louder with each verse. The men stood silently at first, but soon they too were overcome with emotion. Their crying was deep and primal, the kind of grief that comes from losing someone irreplaceable. I continued playing, moved by their obvious devotion to their deceased family member. There was something beautiful about their raw emotion, their willingness to express their love so openly. As I played Amor Eterno, one of the women began to sing along in a voice so hauntingly beautiful it gave me chills. The night air grew colder as I played, and a fog began to roll in from the Rio Grande. The cemetery, which had seemed peaceful when we arrived, now felt ethereal and otherworldly. The family continued their vigil, their grief seeming to intensify with each song. I played for nearly an hour, giving them time to process their emotions and say their final goodbyes. When I finished the last song, one of the men approached me. He extended his hand in gratitude, and when I shook it, his skin was shockingly cold. Not just cool from the night air, but ice cold, as if he'd been standing in a freezer. "Thank you," he said, his voice hollow and distant. "Could you play one more song? Just one more, please." I was about to agree when I heard footsteps approaching. A security guard was walking toward us, carrying a large flashlight and wearing an expression of irritation. "Hey there," he called out. "The cemetery's closed for the night. You folks need to wrap this up and head home." I looked at him confused. "I'm sorry, officer. I'm just finishing up here with this family. They're paying their respects to their loved one." The guard stopped and looked around, shining his flashlight in a wide circle. "What family? You've been standing here talking to yourself for the past 20 minutes. I turned to point out the family, but the cemetery was empty. The men and women who had been there just moments before had vanished completely. There were no signs that anyone had been there at all, no flowers, no evidence of mourning, nothing. "That's impossible," I stammered. "There were 5 people here just a minute ago, 3 women and 2 men. They hired me to play at this grave." The guard walked over to the headstone I'd been playing beside and shone his light on it. "Son, this grave is over a week old. The family that was buried here. Well, it's interesting you should mention 5 people." He paused, studying the inscription on the headstone. "Last week, we buried a family of 5 who died in a car accident on Highway 35. 3 women and 2 men. The whole family was coming back from a wedding in San Antonio when their car went off the road." My head began to spin. That's not possible. I was just talking to them. They hired me to play." The guard's expression softened. "Look, I don't know what you experienced here tonight, but I've been working at this cemetery for 15 years. I've seen and heard things that would make your hair stand on end. All I can tell you is that family died together, and maybe they wanted to say goodbye together too." He helped me gather my equipment, and I left the cemetery in a daze. I walked home through the quiet streets of Laredo, my mind reeling with what had just happened. I'd always heard stories about spirits and supernatural encounters, but I'd never believed them. I was a practical man, a musician who dealt in melody and rhythm, not ghosts and mysteries. But that night, I learned that sometimes the line between the living and the dead is thinner than we think. Sometimes, love is so strong that it transcends death itself. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough, you get to be part of something beautiful and mysterious that defies all explanation. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. How could I? Who would believe that I'd played a concert for a family of ghosts? But every year on Dia de los Muertos, I return to that cemetery with my guitar. I play those same songs by that same grave, just in case they're listening. Just in case they need to hear their favorite music one more time. Because I learned something important that night. Music has the power to reach across the divide between life and death. It can comfort the living and give peace to the departed. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you get to be the bridge between both worlds, if only for a single, unforgettable evening. My name is Daniel, and I'm one of the most experienced tourist guides in the area of the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. A mountain range that crosses several rural communities and is full of forgotten stories. Most of the hikers who come here do so seeking tranquility, beautiful landscapes, or simply an experience away from urban life. However, what many don't know is that these mountains keep dark secrets, secrets that few know, and that some try to forget at all costs. It all began a month ago, when a group of young hikers contacted me to guide them through a little-traveled route. They said they wanted to do something different, something away from traditional tourist routes, and I recommended an itinerary that would take them to an abandoned mountain refuge, known among locals as the Refuge of the Forgotten. This place, although it was just a deteriorated stone construction, had a history that always left me with a strange taste in my mouth. For years, no one had wanted to approach it, and only a few elderly people in town still whispered about what happened there. I myself had never dared to visit it, but for some reason, I thought it would be a good opportunity to try it with a group of young people willing to face all kinds of challenges. The refuge was located about 4 hours walking from the last town, between cliffs and thick forests. The route wasn't easy. Fog usually wrapped around the mountain in mid-afternoon, and the terrain was treacherous, with wet soils and slippery rocks. But the kids, all college students, were excited about the adventure. Somehow their energy was contagious to the others, and in their enthusiasm for the unknown, it seemed they ignored any warning. The day we ventured into the mountain, the weather wasn't the best. There was a light drizzle that turned into thick fog as we climbed the trail. Everyone was somewhat tired, but their eyes reflected a mixture of excitement and curiosity. Although honestly, something in the air seemed strange to me. The mountain, in its gray silence, seemed to be watching us, as if it was testing us. The refuge was located in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The construction, which had originally been a refuge for mountaineers many years ago, now looked crumbling and covered with moss. The door, which had once been solid wood, was now half collapsed and creaked with every wind. The broken windows and cracks in the walls gave it a ghostly appearance. We approached with caution. I, as a guide, always made sure the group was well prepared, but there was something in the environment that made me feel uncomfortable. When we entered the refuge, the air was heavy, as if it hadn't been ventilated in years. The interior was completely empty, with only some old and abandoned furniture scattered on the floor, covered with dust and cobwebs. However, there was something else, something I couldn't identify immediately, but that filled me with a sensation of discomfort. One of the young people, Lucas, stepped forward and began inspecting the fireplace. His curiosity caught my attention, since honestly, there wasn't much to explore in the refuge. Suddenly, his voice interrupted the silence. "Hey, look at this." We approached, and Lucas pointed to a small compartment in the stone wall near the fireplace. It was a small rusted iron door, almost hidden among the cracks in the wall. At first I thought it was just an old trapdoor that led to the ventilation system or something similar. But when we opened it, we found something much more disturbing. Inside the small compartment was a steep staircase that descended into darkness. The air in that part of the refuge felt even denser, as if something in that place had remained closed for years, waiting to be found. Everyone looked at each other, and although some showed reluctance, the group of young people decided to go down, encouraged by the possibility of finding something interesting. We descended with caution. The staircase creaked under our feet, and the light from our flashlights barely illuminated the moss-covered stone steps. At the end of the staircase, we found ourselves in a kind of small stone tunnel, wide enough for all of us to move, but narrow enough to feel claustrophobic. At the end of the tunnel was a solid wooden door that was sealed with thick, rusted nails. A nervous murmur began to spread among the group, but we approached intrigued. It was evident that door had been closed for a long time. Lucas, without thinking, began hitting it, trying to force it. After a few moments, a deep creak was heard, and the door opened with difficulty. Upon crossing the threshold, the atmosphere changed immediately. The air was cold and humid, and the smell of mold and rot filled our lungs. Inside the room, our flashlights revealed what seemed to be a small room with walls covered with strange marks and symbols. Some of these marks seemed written in a language I couldn't identify. But there was something disturbing about them. They were like scribbles, but their forms seemed to be arranged in a way that made no sense. The floor was covered by something we couldn't identify at first. It seemed like a mixture between compacted earth and something else, a sticky residue that adhered to our boots. But the most disturbing thing was what was in the center of the room. A kind of improvised altar made of stacked stones, on which rested an old leather book, dirty and aged by time. Someone, I don't remember who, took it in their hands, and upon opening it, the flashlight light illuminated the pages, revealing strange writings, almost like a diary. Lucas began reading in a low voice. At first, they were just incomprehensible words, but as minutes passed, his face began to transform. Cold sweat appeared on his forehead, and his voice, which before was calm, began to tremble. "We shouldn't be here. This isn't right," he whispered without taking his eyes off the book. At that moment, a sensation of uneasiness enveloped us, as if the mountain itself was watching us. And then we heard something. A distant tapping, soft at first, but gradually increasing, as if something was moving in the distance, or more precisely, as if something was awakening in the bowels of the earth. We all remained silent, and the tension in the air was palpable. No one dared to speak. Suddenly, the sound stopped being distant and began to approach rapidly, as if something was running toward us. A freezing wind began to blow through the tunnel cracks, extinguishing some of our flashlights. Without warning, the door we had opened closed violently, and the room was plunged into almost absolute darkness. It was then that I understood what we had unleashed. It wasn't a simple abandoned refuge or an unimportant story. The place had been a refuge, yes, but not for mountaineers. It was a refuge for something much older, something that had been waiting in the darkness, sealed for generations. Terror took hold of all of us. The earth began to tremble, and the echoes of those blows intensified. Something big and dangerous was awakening. We looked at each other without knowing what to do while darkness swallowed us completely. At that moment, I understood that we should never have gone there. We had ventured into a place that wasn't meant to be found, and now it was too late. The trembling under our feet increased, and the air, dense and heavy, pressed our chests like unbearable pressure. No one dared to move. We were all paralyzed, looking at the closed door with the same mixture of terror and bewilderment. The room, before cold, became even more freezing, as if something invisible had entered with us and was watching us. The tapping became louder, but they no longer came from the entrance hallway. No, now they seemed to emerge from the very walls of the refuge, as if the entire place was breathing. Lucas, still with the book in his hands, began looking toward the room entrance with desperation. His face was pale, almost gaunt, and his eyes reflected such deep fear that I couldn't bear it. "We have to get out now," he said through gritted teeth. And for a moment, his voice was the only one that broke the terrifying silence. I tried to move despite the terror I felt, but something stopped me. There was an invisible force, a strange weight that kept me glued to the floor. Each of us seemed trapped in a trance, looking toward the closed door, waiting for something or someone to appear. But at the same time, we didn't want to see it. Suddenly, the sound we had been hearing stopped being a tapping. It transformed into something else, something that sounded like a kind of whisper. It wasn't a human voice, not even something we could classify as natural. It was a distant, grave sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth, a vibration that was felt throughout the body. It chilled my blood. I couldn't help it. I turned my head toward the book Lucas was still holding, as if something in those pages had let escape what we were feeling. My mind tried to find a rational explanation, but it was as if all my ideas vanished in front of the oppressive presence that invaded the room. Lucas apparently also understood it, because suddenly he dropped the book to the floor, as if it were the last thing he wanted to have in his hands. The others began to react. Marta, one of the girls in the group, began walking toward the door, as if the impulse to flee was the only thing dominating her thoughts. But when she reached the threshold, the same freezing wind that had blown before pushed her back, throwing her to the floor with such force that her scream resonated throughout the room. "No, we can't get out," Lucas shouted with bulging eyes. It was the last thing he said before a strange shadow, like a kind of dark mist, emerged from the wall. No one saw exactly where it came from, but that shadow began to move, sliding slowly toward us. The air thickened more, as if the very atmosphere was being absorbed by something, and the temperature dropped frighteningly. No one dared to move a muscle. We didn't know what to do. The shadow advanced without hurry, but with a presence that seemed to fill the entire space, covering every corner. The whisper we had heard before intensified, becoming a grave, almost guttural sound, as if the refuge itself was trying to speak. I felt pressure in my ears, as if the sound was going through me, and vision began to become blurry, as if something was interfering with my ability to see clearly. Suddenly, the floor under our feet vibrated violently, making us all lose balance. A deafening roar made us cover our ears, but the noise seemed to come from everywhere, as if the refuge itself was about to collapse. And it was then that I saw something that left me paralyzed. The shadow, which until that moment only seemed to flow from the walls, took shape. A tall and thin figure, whose form was indistinct and amorphous, began to materialize in front of us. It wasn't completely solid, rather it seemed like a mass of fluid darkness with contours that vanished in the air. From the figure emerged eyes as dark as the shadow itself. I couldn't see well, but I felt as if they were looking directly at me. I couldn't escape that gaze. It was as if all the terror, all the pain and suffering of the place were concentrated in that presence. It was the manifestation of something ancient, something that had been waiting a long time to return to the surface. The group, despite their terror, began moving toward the staircase by instinct, without speaking. Marta had already gotten up, visibly affected, and the others, trembling, headed toward the tunnel without saying a word. We knew we couldn't stay there. We dragged ourselves more than walked. Fear prevented us from seeing clearly, and the sensation that the shadow was following us kept us all alert. When we reached the staircase, I stopped for a second to see the others. Each one was pale, breathing with difficulty, as if they had been running for hours. But not everyone had reached the foot of the staircase. I looked back and saw that Lucas had stayed behind, still observing the shadowy figure that had been following us. His eyes were fixed on it as if he were hypnotized. "Lucas, come here," I shouted desperately, but he didn't react. At that moment, the shadow advanced toward him, and his body began to convulse, as if something was absorbing him. It was a horrifying scene. The shadow surrounded him completely, and his scream was instantly silenced, as if an invisible hand had muted him. In the blink of an eye, Lucas disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Terror took hold of us. Without saying anything more, the others began climbing the staircase, pushing each other in our desperation to escape. When we reached the hallway and tried to open the door we had crossed, we realized something had changed. The door that had been closed before was now completely blocked from the other side. No one answered us. It was as if the place had closed its cycle, as if it was trapping us. Finally, we found a broken window that led to the outside. The fog had begun to dissipate a bit, and the moonlight gave us hope. With what little strength we had left, we managed to open the window and get out into the open air. Terrified, we ran downhill without looking back. We didn't care what we left behind or if someone else was still there. We only knew we had to get away. When we finally reached the town at dawn, fear was still in our bodies, and the silence surrounding us seemed as deep as the shadow we had left behind. But the worst of all was that when I looked back, I saw something I will never forget. On the mountain top where the refuge was, something dark, something I couldn't understand, was moving slowly among the shadows. No one else has returned to the refuge. No one talks about what happened, and fear continues to weigh on each of us. But now I know that mountain keeps more secrets than I ever imagined, and although we try to forget it, it will always be there, waiting for us. The days following our escape from the refuge were filled with a heavy silence that none of us could break. When we reached the town, exhausted and traumatized, we tried to explain what had happened to the local authorities, but our words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The sheriff, an older man who had lived in those mountains all his life, listened to our account with a mixture of skepticism and something else I couldn't quite identify. When we mentioned Lucas's disappearance, he organized a search party. But after 3 days of searching the area around the refuge, they found no trace of him. The official report stated that Lucas had probably fallen into one of the many crevices that dot the mountain landscape, and that his body might never be recovered. The case was closed with remarkable speed, and we were advised to seek psychological help to deal with the trauma of losing a friend in a mountaineering accident. But I knew what I had seen. We all did. The college students returned to their homes, and I haven't heard from any of them since. I imagine they're trying to forget, to convince themselves it was all a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. As for me, I couldn't continue working as a guide. Every time I looked toward those mountains, I felt the same oppressive presence we had encountered in the refuge. The other guides in the area began to avoid me, saying I had become strange after the incident. I started researching the history of that particular refuge, diving into old town records and speaking with the eldest residents. What I discovered only confirmed my worst fears. The refuge hadn't been abandoned randomly. It had been deliberately sealed after a series of disappearances in the early 1900s. An old woman named Mrs. Henderson, who was nearly 90 years old, told me in whispers about her grandfather's stories. He had been part of the group that sealed the refuge back then. According to her, something had been awakened during the construction of the original shelter, something that had been sleeping deep within the mountain for centuries. They thought they could contain it, she said, her voice barely audible. But you can't contain something like that forever. It just waits. It's patient. She told me that every few generations, someone would find their way to the refuge, drawn by curiosity or accident. And every time, people would disappear. The local authorities had learned to simply classify these incidents as hiking accidents, to avoid panic and to keep people away from the area. "Your friend," she said, looking directly into my eyes, "he's not dead. Not in the way you understand death. He's part of it now, part of what guards that place." Her words chilled me to the bone, but they also explained something that had been bothering me since that night. In my dreams, I could hear Lucas's voice, calling to me from somewhere far away, somewhere dark. Sometimes I would wake up with the distinct feeling that he was trying to warn me about something. 3 months after the incident, I made a decision that I knew was foolish, but I couldn't resist. I had to go back. I had to see the refuge one more time to try to understand what had really happened to Lucas. I went alone this time, carrying nothing but a flashlight and my camera. The hike to the refuge felt different this time, as if the mountain itself was watching my approach. The trees seemed to lean in closer to the path, and the usual sounds of wildlife were completely absent. When I reached the clearing where the refuge stood, I was shocked by what I saw. The building looked exactly as it had when we first found it, but something was different. The broken window we had escaped through was now perfectly intact, as if it had never been damaged. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The door to the refuge was closed, but not locked. It opened easily at my touch, creaking softly on its hinges. Inside, everything was clean. There was no dust, no debris, no sign that the place had been abandoned for decades. And there, sitting at the old wooden table we had seen during our first visit, was Lucas. He looked exactly as he had that terrible night, except for his eyes. His eyes were completely black, like the shadow that had taken him. He smiled when he saw me, but it wasn't Lucas's smile. It was something else wearing his face. "I've been waiting for you, Daniel," he said in a voice that sounded like his own, but carried harmonics of something much older and deeper. "You can't leave, you know. None of you can really leave. The mountain doesn't let go of what belongs to it." I ran. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, not stopping until I reached my truck at the base of the mountain. I drove straight to the police station, but when I tried to report what I had seen, they looked at me as if I had lost my mind. The sheriff pulled me aside and told me, in no uncertain terms, that if I continued to spread wild stories about the mountain, I would be considered a public menace and dealt with accordingly. It was clear that the local authorities knew more than they were letting on. That was 6 months ago. I've since moved away from North Carolina, settling in a small town in Ohio where the land is flat and there are no mountains in sight. But I can't escape the feeling that I'm being watched, that something is following me. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I can hear Lucas's voice on the wind, calling my name, inviting me to come back home to the mountain. Each time, it becomes a little harder to resist. I know that one day, I'll return to that refuge. Not because I want to, but because I have to. Because whatever is up there isn't finished with me yet. And when that day comes, I fear I'll join Lucas at that table, waiting for the next group of curious souls to stumble upon our secret. The mountain is patient. It can wait forever, and it never forgets. My name is Andrew, and I'm a recreational mountaineer. Though I don't consider myself an expert, I've always enjoyed the tranquility that the mountains offer. Before I begin this account, I'd like to know where you're listening from. I enjoy hearing these stories from my audience. Feel free to leave comments. Without further delay, let's begin. I was prepared, conscious that mountain dangers are not something to be underestimated. However, once again, nature showed me that one never has total control, no matter how prepared you are. It all began one October afternoon when I decided to take a hike through the mountains surrounding my town in Colorado. The idea was simple: climb up to the mountain refuge, a small isolated place where I could spend the night and continue the next day. This refuge, known by the locals, was a few hours' walk from the starting point. It wasn't a difficult traverse, but as always, I took the necessary precautions. My backpack was loaded with the basics: food, water, a flashlight, an extra jacket, and of course my phone, though I knew I wouldn't have signal on the trail. The weather was somewhat cloudy, but I wasn't too worried. I had checked the forecast, and no rain was expected. After all, I've climbed in much worse conditions and have always managed to return home without incidents. As I ascended the trail, I felt increasingly isolated, and the tranquility of the mountain enveloped me. The sun began to set just as I reached the refuge. It was a small wooden structure built with the idea of offering shelter to mountaineers, a kind of safe haven for those who, like me, decided to spend the night in the heights. Everything was in its place. The fireplace was cold, the bunks covered with blankets that smelled of old wood, and a couple of rustic wooden tables. It seemed like a perfect place to rest. I sat by the window, looking at the landscape covered by thick fog. There was no wind, only the stillness of the mountain. I decided to light the fireplace to bring some warmth to the refuge, as the temperature was beginning to drop rapidly. While waiting for the fire to gain strength, I prepared some food. It was then that I heard the first thunder. It was a distant sound, but over time it grew closer. I thought it might be a passing storm, enough to delay my return trip the next day. So without much to fear, I settled by the fire and pulled a book from my backpack. But the storm didn't pass. On the contrary, it intensified. The wind began to hit the refuge walls with force, and the rain started to fall with such violence that the sound was deafening. In just minutes, the storm unleashed all its fury. The windows trembled, and at times the sound of the wind almost covered the noise of the fire. I thought it would be better to stay there for the night. It made no sense to try to descend under those conditions. As the hours passed, the storm showed no signs of subsiding. Instead of diminishing, the wind intensified, and the raindrops felt like small stones when they hit the roof. Night had fallen completely, and the darkness outside was total, impenetrable. I couldn't see anything beyond the window. I got up to check if everything was properly closed. Through the crack in the door, I could see how the storm was lashing the landscape with fury, as if the mountain itself was reacting to something. The fireplace remained lit, but the heat it produced was no longer enough to dispel the cold that was beginning to take over the refuge. I felt a strange discomfort. The place that at first seemed like a safe refuge now seemed smaller, more closed. The humidity from the storm was beginning to infiltrate the walls, and the air, though warm from the fire, had a heavy smell. Something inside me said I should leave, but it was impossible to go out in those weather conditions. Suddenly something changed, something I couldn't identify at first, but that left me uneasy. I heard a knock on the door, not a loud knock, but noticeable enough to put me on alert. I thought it might be the wind that, with the storm, had caused some branch to crash against the wood. But the knock repeated, this time louder. Fear began to course through me. I couldn't explain it, but somehow I felt watched. I snapped out of my trance when I realized that the fire in the fireplace was beginning to go out. I ran to stoke it, but while doing so, I heard another knock, this time coming from the roof. I remained silent, waiting, but what came next was even more disturbing. From somewhere nearby, I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it might be the sound of the storm, but the footsteps were different. They were human footsteps, firm, as if someone was walking outside the refuge. I looked through the window, but saw nothing more than the fog and the rain that wouldn't stop. My heart beat faster. I felt pressure in my chest, as if all the air in the refuge had been sucked out. I returned to the door hoping to see someone who had been trapped by the storm. It could be another person who, like me, had sought refuge. But when I opened the door, there was no one. The storm continued roaring outside, and a strange silence took over the refuge. I closed the door and approached the window again. And then I saw it, a diffuse shadow moving in the distance among the trees. It couldn't be an animal, not even a human. It was something much stranger. It seemed to glide in the darkness without making noise, but still, its presence was palpable. My mind couldn't process it. I decided to stay inside, sure that the best thing was not to go out under any circumstances. I returned to the fire, and while stoking it, something else disturbed me. The atmosphere of the refuge was no longer the same. The air seemed dense, stale, and the shadow I had seen outside was no longer the only strange thing. A murmur began to fill the air, a low and constant sound, as if someone was speaking in a low voice, very close to me. I looked everywhere, but there was no one. The refuge walls weren't moving, but the noise persisted. Suddenly I heard a scratching, as if something was dragging itself over the wood of the roof. My mind could no longer think clearly. I ran to the door, but as I approached, the handle loosened. It was stuck. I tried to open it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The storm roared outside, and inside the refuge everything seemed to be changing. I didn't understand what was happening, but something told me I shouldn't stay there. I ran to the windows, and it was then that I saw the footprints. At first, I thought they were a product of my imagination, but upon closer inspection, I realized that something had left them. They were mud prints, but strangely, they led toward the interior of the refuge, not outward. My breathing quickened. I had no time to think. I looked around searching for something to defend myself with, but there was nothing, only the aged wood and damp blankets. The murmur in the air became louder, almost unbearable. I felt that something was about to happen, something I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the fire in the fireplace went out completely. In total darkness, I could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. I turned toward the door, but the handle was still stuck. The storm that had been my refuge at first now seemed to be the backdrop for something much more sinister. Then I understood. The refuge was not a safe place. It never had been. It was a place where those who entered didn't leave, and I was trapped. Panic began to take hold of me with force. I found myself trapped in an isolated place, with the storm out of control, and something strange happening inside the refuge. The cold of the night, which before seemed like a nuisance, now felt like a palpable presence that enveloped me. The lack of light, the total darkness that loomed over me, seemed like a harbinger of the worst. My hands trembled, and the sound of those approaching footsteps, That slow and rhythmic scratching only increased my anxiety. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm myself. I knew that fear can cloud judgment, and I needed to think clearly if I wanted to get out of there. The first thing I should do was make sure the door was really blocked. I put all my strength into the handle, trying to open it again. But the wood of the door creaked in a way that made me wonder if something else was holding it back. Suddenly, the scratching I had heard stopped. It was as if the entire world had stopped in absolute silence, so heavy I could almost touch it. My breathing was the only thing I could hear. I looked through the window, but all I could see was the dense fog and rain hitting the wooden walls. I couldn't see beyond a few yards, and that made me even more nervous. The feeling of being watched, that pressure in my chest, wouldn't dissipate. The murmur began again, but this time it seemed to come from a different direction, closer, as if someone or something was right behind the refuge walls. It made no sense. The walls were thick, solid wood, and there was no way someone could be so close that I would notice. However, the sound was unmistakable. Someone was there. I looked around the refuge, searching for something to defend myself with, something I could use in case the situation really turned violent. I saw a small axe hanging next to the fireplace. It wasn't much, but at least it would give me something to respond with if the situation became violent. I walked quickly toward it, taking it with trembling hands, and held it tightly, feeling the cold wood against my sweaty palms. My mind was racing, analyzing everything that had happened up to that moment. The footprints on the floor, the strange murmur, the footsteps that didn't seem to come from anywhere. All of this wasn't normal, and my instinct told me I should get out of there, that the storm wasn't the only threat. Suddenly, a sound of something heavy hitting the roof made me jump. I couldn't take it anymore. I made a decision at that instant. I would leave even if it meant facing the storm. I ran to the door once more, but before I could try again, I heard a dull thud coming from the wall right next to me. Fear froze me for a second. Something was behind the wall, moving slowly, crawling. It was a low and deep sound, as if something heavy was advancing, brushing against the wood. I wanted to scream, but the words got stuck in my throat. There was no time. Somehow I knew that whatever was on the other side of that wall wasn't human. I could no longer think rationally. I was trapped, and every second that passed brought me closer to the unknown. Without thinking, I took the axe and began hitting the door with all my strength. Each blow was more desperate than the last. I hit once, twice, and then a third time. The wood began to give way, but with each blow I felt as if something was watching me more closely, as if that presence behind the walls was getting closer, waiting for the right moment. The noise of the wind outside intensified, and for a moment I could almost believe that the storm was inside, as if the storm itself was infiltrating the refuge. But then the door gave way, a piece of wood broke, and I could see a bit of the exterior darkness. I didn't hesitate for another second. I ran toward the opening with the axe in one hand and pushed the door with my foot. The cold, humid air hit me immediately, but I didn't care. I jumped out without looking back. I was outside in the abyss of the storm, but at least I had left the refuge behind. However, it wasn't the relief I expected. Something wasn't right. The storm continued to be just as intense, if not worse. Visibility was zero, and the wind lashed me with such force that it almost made me lose my balance. I felt that the mountain itself was pushing me back, as if trying to prevent my escape. I couldn't stay there. I ran aimlessly. My only guide was the diffuse line of the mountains and the shadows of trees that could barely be seen. The sound of the storm enveloped me, but at the same time I felt as if something else was following me, lurking in the darkness. I looked back for a second and saw something that chilled my blood. A shadow that didn't belong to a tree or a rock was sliding quickly through the fog. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be human, but its form was too defined, too present. My mind was completely clouded. I began to run faster, without stopping for a moment. Visibility was zero, and the rugged mountain terrain didn't help. My breathing was labored, and panic made me stumble. Something told me I shouldn't look back, but curiosity was stronger than my common sense. I looked once more and saw something that made my blood freeze. The figure of the shadow, which before seemed like a blurry being, now had a clearer form. It was like a human, but its face wasn't a human face. It was distorted, wrinkled, as if the skin had been deformed under terrible pressure. Fear overcame me, and without thinking further, I fell to my knees, covering my head with my arms. I felt the cold air, the rain lashing me with fury, but something inside me knew I could no longer escape from that thing. The shadow was getting closer and closer, and the wind continued increasing its intensity, as if the entire world was dragging me toward the unknown. But then, as if it were an answer to the chaos surrounding me, I heard a voice. It wasn't the voice of the shadow or a human voice. It was something different, something that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth, whispering my name. Andrew, Andrew. The voice resonated in my ears, deep, insistent, and its tone was as if it knew me, as if it had been waiting for me. The shadow, now closer, raised a hand. I couldn't see it clearly, but its gesture was like an invitation, one that terrified me deeply. What was that thing? What did it want from me? The ground beneath me began to tremble, and the storm became even more fierce. I knew I couldn't stay there, but I also understood that there was no longer a way to escape from what had been unleashed on that mountain. The only option left was to face what was to come. Good evening, Dom. I don't really know where to begin, so I'll follow the order of days, because I'm still trying to understand if everything is really strange or just my imagination. My name is Diana, 32 years old, a teacher at a small rural school. At night, I cling to my old sewing machine. It pays bills and keeps my mind occupied. It's been just over a year since I moved into a large room at the back of Pablo's property. He had renovated old ranch hand dormitories and offered me the best one. It was practical. I could walk to school. He took care of the tenants, and we had coffee together whenever the clock allowed. It might not sound romantic, but for me it was comfort. Our daily routine had an almost clockwork precision. I would wake before the neighbor's rooster, put the kettle on the burner, brew a mug of coffee, and toast 2 pieces of bread. Pablo, returning from his first vegetable delivery, would park his dusty pickup truck, wash his hands at the outdoor sink, and come steal the warm bread. He'd tease me about my hair pinned up with a clothespin. I'd playfully tease him back about his beard, always slightly crooked. When the small failures began, I realized how much that routine gave me ground to stand on. First, the milk soured inside the brand new refrigerator we paid for in 3 installments. I thought about a power outage, but there had been no blackout. The next day, the kitchen light flickered so much I thought it would burn out. I replaced it with another sealed one, and at night it pulsed again in a slow rhythm. Silly things, I know, but they came in sequence. The faucet gushed murky water one morning. Although the water tank had been cleaned recently, some silverware disappeared and reappeared in the sink, covered with rust, as if they had aged years and hours. And finally, a sour smell, similar to forgotten orange peel, that wandered around the kitchen and disappeared before I could find the source. I thought it was my carelessness and complained to Pablo while washing dishes, my apron soaked. "Must be humidity," he grumbled, buried in his mother's medical reports. Even he, so practical, wrinkled his nose when the smell returned that night. He searched cabinets, sniffed the drain, nothing. I wanted to believe we were neurotic. Even so, I went to bed feeling a warm breath coming from the house, something that didn't belong there. Maybe this seems trivial to whoever reads this, but I need to record it before I doubt myself. It was in these little things that everything started to fall apart. The next day in the teacher's lounge, I casually mentioned the strange smell. Did they laugh? Did they say old houses are like that? I didn't insist, but I walked back feeling a pang of shame, as if I had exaggerated. Still, I bought a bottle of pine disinfectant, in an attempt to scrub away any trace of that sourness at night. Up to here, everything still seemed manageable. I just didn't know it was only the beginning. Still in the week of the disinfectant, life seemed to have returned to normal. I taught about germination, graded tests, laughed with the children when a cricket landed on the blackboard. At night, I lent thread to a neighbor who tore her apron. Everything normal until Thursday. It was drizzling lightly, but the air was heavy. Pablo hadn't arrived. I made coffee alone and sat near the door. That's when I noticed a shine in the burned cement corridor. It wasn't water, it was a tiny trail, dotted like coarse salt mixed with blue glitter. I knelt out of curiosity, touched the grains, put them on my tongue, a habit of tasting flour. The taste was bitter, dry, almost metallic. I got up with a start, washed my mouth. My tongue tingled for long minutes. I called out in the yard, thinking some spice bag had torn. No one answered. I took his mother's broom, the one full of superstitions, and pushed the crystals to the drain. When the water carried everything away, the air became dense, as if I had spread invisible dust. That night I dreamed of the fabric woman. I was sewing non-stop, thread running smooth. I felt someone glued to my back. I couldn't see a face, just pieces of cloth patched with childish stitches. In the background, scissors beat in a slow, irritating rhythm. I woke up sweating. The fan was spinning slowly, although turned off. The bitter taste was still there. Pablo arrived at 6, wiping the rain from his forehead. I told him somewhat embarrassed. He inspected the corridor. Some guest was messing with the wrong thing, he muttered, avoiding my eyes. Before leaving, he dropped a bunch of rue on top of the refrigerator. It was his silent way of showing that he too felt fear. I spent the day with that metallic taste and a strange pressure in my stomach. At school, I had to sit when my vision darkened. I blamed low blood pressure so as not to worry. I walked back slowly, fearing to encounter the shine again. When I opened the door, the pine smell had disappeared. There was a smell of damp cloth stored for days. I held the sink firmly, breathed deeply. I planned a hot bath and strong tea, but the night had other plans. I took a quick shower, but the water was too lukewarm, as if the heater was resisting. I put on the first t-shirt I found and sat in front of the machine to finish a student's uniform. Every time the needle went down, the motor choked, breaking the silence of the house. I looked at the clock. Almost midnight. I felt a silly shiver and turned off the living room light, taking the work to the bedroom. I lay down without praying, but kept turning over the memory of that blue trail. I didn't tell anyone that I tasted the salt. I keep hammering at it. What if that was where I opened the door to something that was looking for a way in? Maybe it's just superstition, but shame prevents me from talking. Pablo would deal with it practically. I fear becoming a joke. I fell asleep late with the smell of rue invading everything. I dreamed again of seams, but this time the thread caught my fingers, wrapping up to the root of the nail. I woke up with a numb hand. I spent the rest of the dawn listening to the fine rain and a light tapping on the tiles, like tiny steps that avoided wetting the floor. When the rooster crowed, I swore I saw someone's shadow by the door, but maybe it was the curtain moved by the wind that didn't exist. Monday dawned heavy, the air sticking to the skin. I woke up tired, as if I had pushed the truck in a dream, but I touched the routine. Breakfast for the boys. 4 and 6 years old, lunch boxes, uniforms. Pablo left early, throat hoarse, swearing it was just an irritated throat. At school, the principal asked me to cover 2 classes. I accepted. In the middle of the explanation, the floor spun. I leaned against the wall until the room returned to its place and pretended it was just hunger. I returned home already getting dark and found the oldest hot as an iron, the little one sick in the yard. I took both to the health post, nothing diagnosed beyond rest and serum. On the bus back, my head throbbed along with the electricity bill that was due in 2 days. At night, I tried to finish a dress, but the machine was stubborn. Thread broke, needle bent, motor failing. While struggling with the pedal, I heard a rustle of cloth in the corridor. I opened the door, thinking it was Pablo. Silence, empty corridor. I went to check on the boys. They slept restlessly, murmuring. I sat between them and recognized the smell of damp cloth mixed with metal, like coins forgotten in the rain. I spent the dawn changing cold cloths. Pablo only came in when the sky was getting light, shirt stuck to his chest, sunken eyes. He said the clinic was delayed, locked himself in the bathroom, and didn't speak anymore. The next day, I warned clients that I would delay deliveries. 2 canceled without beating around the bush. Someone had gossiped that my house was heavy. Suddenly, the order book was almost empty. I paid the fabric store with what was left of my savings. The fevers returned at the end of the afternoon. Every sip of water made the boys say their tongues burned. I noticed tiny white spots. I remembered the blue trail and my stomach turned. Pablo started limping, complaining of leg pain. I suggested a doctor. He looked away, promised to see later. The kitchen smelled of newly born mold, despite wide open windows. Clean clothes dawned damp, sticking to our backs. I summarized those 15 days in one word: loss. I lost money, health, and the neighbors' trust. And in the silence between one fever and another, guilt came with force that everything was born from my curiosity, from the bitter salt I tasted and shouldn't have. One morning when I arrived at school, the principal called me aside. One of the mothers asked to change her son's class, saying the boy had been having nightmares after my classes. The principal didn't accuse me of anything, but the message was clear. In the afternoon, in line at the lottery shop, I felt glances escape when I turned around. People whispered my name along with bad luck. It was the first time I considered asking for a transfer. Saturday darkened early, muddy clouds nailed to the sky. Pablo spent the day curled up in the hammock, feverish and quiet. I gave him aspirin, made mint tea. Nothing lowered the temperature. The children, listless, dozed in shifts on the sofa. When night fell completely, I heard a motor stopping at the gate. Through the curtain, I saw the pickup truck. He wasn't driving. A woman in a red coat got out, face very similar to his, only hard. Another, younger one came behind, the daughters he rarely talked about. "Good evening," I ventured on the porch. The older one responded with a dry wave and entered the corridor ahead. Neither asked about the boys. They went straight to the room, carrying bags. I heard the creaking of a door and a murmur too fast for words. I returned to the kitchen, washed dishes that were already clean just to occupy my hands. When I closed the faucet, I noticed dark crumbs on the doorframe, like damp ash. I swept before anyone saw. Almost 11 o'clock and they left. They passed by me without goodbye. The younger one carried something wrapped in black cloth that smelled like blown-out candles. I returned to the room. Pablo was sweating, eyes glued to the ceiling. "Did they bring food?" I asked him. "They said it's just for me," he whispered with a worn voice. On the nightstand, a sealed pot, strong smell of ginger and cinnamon. I stored it in the refrigerator without courage to argue. Sunday before the sun, I woke up with a dry mouth, cell phone in hand, ran to the corridor. In the center there was a circle of black dust the size of a bicycle wheel. Inside, 3 thin little bones. The air smelled of cold ash and burnt sweetener. "Don't step," Pablo murmured, leaning against the wall. "Use mother's shovel, don't touch with skin." I collected everything. The grains vibrated, almost pulsed. I buried it behind the water tank. When I returned, I found Pablo kneeling, praying low. After that, he collapsed. The cough, rarely before, became an attack that doubled him over. His legs failed on the steps. The health post scheduled an X-ray to investigate a shadow in the lung. The word shadow stuck to me all day. At night, the corridor gained children's footsteps. I would put my ear to it and felt more than heard, fabric being torn slowly, fibers crackling. The sour smell returned, mixed with candle smoke. A neighbor complained about the garbage. "There's a rotten animal." I showed clean bags. He left, shaking his head. So we continued. Doctors, fevers, bills, steps. I would sit in front of the machine, but the thread broke. Behind the motor, the sound of torn cloth seemed to charge for every stitch I failed. One dawn, I buried the second circle. It came back exactly the same 2 days later. I sat on the kitchen floor, hands smelling of earth. I cried softly, trying not to wake anyone. I thought about calling my mother, but I was afraid her voice would break me. Pablo dragged himself to the door, asked for water. When I turned on the light, his skin reminded me of wet brown paper. "If I don't come back from the clinic, take care of the rooms," he babbled. "Don't say that now, please," I replied. He tried to smile, coughed blood into the handkerchief. The dark red opened on the cement. Backing away was instinct. Behind me, I felt a cold breath. I turned, and there was no one. Just the corridor lengthened by moonlight, and the clear certainty of an old dress swaying at the end of it. The following week, Pablo left early to redo tests in the big city and never came back to sleep. He sent a short message, said he would stay at the hospital to speed up the results. I breathed relieved that he was in medical hands, but the house became hollow from 1 hour to the next. 2 days later, the daughters appeared again, now without the delicacy of the red coat. They knocked on the door like someone demanding an overdue payment. The older one stared at my apron stained with school paint. "Our father will need money for treatment," she said, firm voice. "We're going to rent that front room today." I tried to argue that the boys slept there. The younger one looked at the walls as if evaluating an empty room. They insisted until a sour knot rose up my stomach. I accepted without having a choice. I took mattresses, toys, sewing machine, and installed myself in a small back room full of mold in the corners. While dragging things, I heard muffled laughter in the living room, laughter of someone getting rid of weight. That same night, Pablo called me clearing his throat. They commented, "I need to resolve some papers. Stay calm, I'll be back soon." Come back for what? They even took our pans. It escaped before I controlled myself. There was silence, then he said he would talk later. 2 days submerged in humidity that stuck to clothes like fine tar. The ceiling of the new room dripped sweat. The bulbs weakened like candles at the end. We slept on the floor, wrapped in blankets that already smelled that insistent sourness. On Wednesday, almost dawn, a car stopped in front. I woke up with headlights leaking through the cracks. I peeked. The daughters were unloading suitcases. One of them carried an empty wheelchair. I didn't touch the lock. I held my breath until the motor disappeared again. In the morning, I found a collection note stuck in the thin door. Deposit the overdue rent by Friday. The paper smelled of fresh varnish, a sign that they were in a hurry to formalize the eviction. Assimilating that was heavier than the mold. In the afternoon, I received a call from the clinic. A tired, bureaucratic voice informed that Pablo had died from severe respiratory complications. The word deceased gave me a cold shock. I hung up before asking for details. I didn't cry. I just felt a tiredness that pulled from within. No funeral, no notice. At night, I piled the toys in a corner and told the children a summarized version. Daddy went to heaven. The oldest asked if the cloth lady also lived there. I swallowed hard. 2 days later, Dona Lucinda, a neighbor who sold corn cake on the corner, appeared with a downcast face. "The mailman left this for you, said it's important," she murmured, handing me a thick old envelope sealed with faded adhesive tape. "Thank you. Do you know where it came from?" "I just found it at the gate, no stamp, nothing." I closed the door with trembling legs, sat on the floor, children playing nearby. I tore the tape. Inside a worn letter, failed pen, Pablo's handwriting. He said that years before, digging to open a ditch, he had found a package covered with black wax and wire. He thought it was garbage, threw it in a fire. That same month, he told, the region's crops dried up, and a cowboy lost his son in a strange accident. He wrote that the daughters, fearing losing the inheritance, sought help from a woman who charged dearly to tie the bad luck to his blood, and whoever else lived in the same house. He asked forgiveness for never having told, and for the damage I probably already felt. The rest was blurred, illegible. When I finished reading, I noticed that the ink had left my fingers dark. I smelled it, odor of melted candle and burnt fabric. I washed with soap. It didn't come out immediately. It was as if his story marked my skin. I spent the night turning the letter from one side to the other, hunting for instructions that didn't exist. Around 2, the door creaked without any wind. I got up slowly. The corridor was empty, but the floor showed a very fine trail of black dust going from the main room, now locked, to the hole under the tank where I had buried the second circle. The boys whimpered in sync, and the room seemed to shrink with the crying. I felt like running, but my legs became heavy like wet clay. I pushed the dresser against the door, kept the letter inside a pillowcase, and sat with the children embraced, repeating words of calm that I myself didn't believe. When the sky cleared, there were marks of small hands on the wall, made of that dust. No child would reach so high. And I understood, finally, that the house didn't want me, or maybe it wanted exactly me, for something I still couldn't name. The move happened in less than a week. Lydia, a recently separated teaching colleague, heard my whispers of despair on the phone and offered the extension behind her house. A rectangular room, tiny bathroom, window to the yard where loaded orange trees hid the wall. Nothing luxurious, but without the mold that was already sticking to our clothes. I arrived with 2 suitcases, the portable machine and the children clinging to my legs. Lydia helped divide the space. Cot for me, mattress against the wall for them, small table for sewing. I thanked more times than I remember. She replied that solidarity is like warm bread. You don't deny it. The first week went without scares. The orange trees beat leaves on the roof. The citrus smell entered through the cracks, and I even believed that distance was enough to break the cycle. I killed ants, hung a rosary at the headboard, went back to accepting small orders. Lydia laughed when she caught me singing while aligning. On the 8th dawn, while reviewing hems, the bulb flickered. I sighed, thinking the wiring was old, but kept pedaling slowly, being careful not to wake anyone. The machine motor twisted twice and stopped. I thought about overheating, raised my head, felt fingers close on the top of my bun, and pull with dry force. The smell of damp cloth invaded the room like vapor. I screamed low, turned suddenly. There was no one. The door slept closed, window locked. I breathed intermittently, hand on the accelerated chest, tried to find an explanation. I touched my hair, a lock was missing. The bulb stabilized, motor went back to purring alone, without the pedal. I pulled the plug from the socket, slammed the door, and got under the blanket between the boys who slept heavily. In the morning, Lydia noticed my scarf, covering the hair hole. Working late again, she joked, serving steaming couscous. I told only half so as not to seem crazy. She listened quietly, firm eyes. If it happens again, call, she said, hands squeezing my shoulder. The next night, I kept the machine turned off. While washing dishes, the radio on the refrigerator turned on by itself in a static hiss that reminded of tearing seams. I turned it off at the button. It rekindled at the same instant louder. Lydia entered from the frightened, sweating corridor. The radio went silent. We looked at each other in silence, each stretching their ear to what maybe didn't exist. The boys started waking up punctually at 3, crying muffled, saying the lady whispered stories about needles inside eyes. I noticed thin red scratches on their arms. They looked like cat scratches, but we had no animals. I applied ointment, scheduled pediatrician. The doctor suggested allergy to the neighbor's soap. I left the office with the word allergy echoing empty. I tried to stop sewing after dinner, but the bills kept coming. On the 3rd dawn, I aligned the pedal reluctantly. 2 needlefuls later, the needle broke in a dry crack and the metal piece flew, scratching my face below the eyebrow. Blood ran hot. I used a clean floor cloth to staunch. When I lowered it, I saw the thread outside the machine wind itself alone, firm, until strangling the spool. The smell of blown-out candles accompanied. I screamed Lydia's name. She entered running, hair falling. "Is there someone here?" I whispered, trembling. She walked through the room in short steps, saw the tight thread, the trickle of blood, didn't doubt. She took the scissors from the apron pocket and cut the thread at once. The spool spun slow, as if surrendered. The room seemed to inflate and in a sigh relax into a damp silence. Lydia pushed the machine against the wall. "From now on, sewing only during the day with me at home," she decreed. I nodded, pressing the cloth on the eyebrow. She wanted to take me to the emergency room. I preferred Band-Aid and prayer. We slept at 4 in the same room, corridor light on. In the middle of the night, I felt weight on my feet, as if someone was sitting watching the breathing. I didn't open my eyes, held the older son's hand, and counted mentally to 100. When I finally dared to look, I saw only the curtains swaying, although the air was still. The next morning, Lydia swept the yard and found my hair lock stuck on an orange tree branch wrapped in black thread. She threw everything in the wood stove, without warning me first. The flame crackled high, spreading the smell of melted plastic mixed with burnt peel. The day passed without incidents, but when collecting sheets, I noticed that the eyebrow scar looked like a crooked letter, like basting stitch, too tangled. It didn't hurt, just throbbed when I remembered, and I remembered all the time. I understood then that distance wasn't enough. That thing clung to me like smoke smell on party clothes. And I also realized that Lydia, however brave, had limits. The shadow was already crossing our door threshold. The weight on the house became so palpable that the yard seemed to breathe. Lydia started locking her room door. She said it was for security, but deep down I knew she feared waking up with something sitting at the foot of the bed. I also feared. In the rare dawns when sleep took me, I dreamed of threads running under the skin, sewing my fingers to each other until I could no longer touch my children. On a stuffy afternoon, I went out to hang sheets and felt the soft ground near the orange tree. The earth formed a little mound that didn't exist days before. I crouched, dug with my fingers. A package of damp gray fabric emerged, tied by thick black thread. The smell of burnt candle came strong, mixed with old iron. I unearthed it delicately, and just by touching it, I felt a familiar buzz inside my ear, like the sewing machine choking. I took the package to the empty kitchen. I put it on the spread newspaper. I cut the thread with pruning scissors. Inside, a clumsy doll sewn hastily with colorful scraps. On the chest, a large button where someone had drawn a face without eyes. On the side, a tuft of thick brown hair, identical to mine. My heart raced in a jolt that almost made me drop everything. At that moment, I understood that the dust trails, the circles, and even the torn lock had the right address. Each item fed that doll. The nausea came in waves. I ran to the bathroom, and in the mirror I saw my scar pulse, living seam, demanding more thread. When Lydia returned from work, I showed the package. This was in the yard. My God, who would do such a thing? It doesn't matter who anymore, I need to break it. She suggested looking for the herb healer at the market. We remembered that weeks before an old lady selling herbs had given me a mixture to clean the old house. Maybe she would know what to do. We went the next day. We found her at the same narrow stall, lavender smell surrounding. I told everything. She stared at me without blinking, caught her fingers on the counter slat. She said that dolls like that are roots, seeds of evil. But this one here is different. It's not just malice, it's hunger. Hunger for thread, for needle, for work that doesn't end. She ordered to burn it in a fire without wind, pray Psalm 90 whole, leave what remained in a riverbed before sunrise. She said, however, that she could feel the chain to measure the strength. She extended her hand over the doll, pulled back immediately, shuddering. "There's something stuck there that's already tasted your blood," she whispered. "Burning might free what's inside, but it can also release the seamstress for good. And she'll want to finish the job on your skin." I returned home with instructions throbbing. At midnight, Lydia and I piled wood in the yard. The wind was still, the orange trees motionless. I put the doll in the crack of the flames, started the psalm. When I cited, "You will not fear the night terror," the fire crackled, spitting blue sparks that drew sewing dots in the dark air. The leaves around hissed without touching embers. The flame became black like boiling ink. The doll's black thread retracted, singing thin. Lydia held my trembling pulse. I continued the prayer, but my voice failed. Inside my head, I heard the crack of scissors opening, closing, cutting the air. The doll inflated, tearing the scraps, until revealing inside something hard, shiny, the size of an egg, black wax covering twisted wire. It was the same artifact Pablo described in the letter. The wind returned, whipping fire in our direction. Lydia screamed, "Let's back up!" The wax egg exploded in a dry crack and a cloud of soot rose high. Then it descended slow, sticking to the skin like wet road dust. I coughed, throat burned. The smoke formed in the air the outline of a very thin woman, sewn body, tilted head. It only lasted a blink, but Lydia saw too. She fell to her knees, praying in tears. When the fire finally lowered, charcoal remained crumbled, marked with golden threads, the same shine as the glitter. I collected with shovel, put in a glass jar, screwed the lid. The clock marked 3 in the morning. I felt my fingers numb, as if invisible threads tightened the joints. The boys cried inside. We slept little. When waking, I noticed black stains on the sheet at the height of my feet, as if something had dripped during the night. The scar pulsed under thicker skin. Lydia called, asking for forgiveness. She needed to take her son to Grandma's house for a few days and cool her head. I understood immediately. She was backing away before that thing stuck to her forever. I was alone in the extension, holding the dark jar, unable to decide whether to throw it in the river or bury it far away. In the afternoon, without any wind, the roof groaned under light steps that came and went. The kitchen light turned on by itself, yellowish light, flickering. The radio hissed low. In the frequency of the hiss, I heard a female voice humming a lullaby, but the words came out without vowels, only the rustle of seams. I didn't run anymore, Dom. I just sat on the bed, jar in my lap, and asked forgiveness out loud to whoever it was. I asked for me, for the boys, for the people who had already suffered. The voice disappeared, but the bulb remained on, insistent, illuminating the crooked seams of my trembling knees. I decided it was time to leave before the jar cracked, or I myself cracked. I sold the portable machine for almost nothing at the Sunday fair. I gathered change, stuffed 2 changes of clothes, and the jar wrapped in a burlap bag. I asked for temporary transfer at school. They accepted, because no one wants to teach far from the city. I took the boys on a bus that shakes more than it moves. We got off near a tiny village, just a dirt road crossed by cocoa and banana trees. I rented a room at the back of a family house that raises chickens. The owner, a lady with a hoarse voice, asked no questions, just warned to keep the gate closed because of the foxes. I felt gratitude and fear in the same measure. The room is simple. 2 bunk beds, small table, little window that looks out to the plantation. I didn't bring machine, nor threads, nor needles. Now I sharpen the red pencil on notebooks. I correct simple accounts. I teach to read slowly. At night, instead of sewing, I write this email trying to put reins on memories. I miss the sound of the needle crossing the fabric. I miss it like phantom pain, but I don't risk anymore. The boys took time to sleep the first week. They asked me to leave the oil lamp on. I left it. Gradually, the youngest stopped waking up crying. The oldest went back to playing with cars in the beaten earth. There's no smell of damp cloth, no flickering light. The house creaks the way old houses creak. It just seems like peace, but the silence here is thick, as if it charged admission. I kept the soot jar inside a kerosene can, buried at the foot of a jatoba tree far from the fence. I did this at dawn when even the chickens doze. I didn't pray, didn't recite psalm, just whispered, "Enough." The earth was smooth, no sign of disturbance, and the day continued unhurried like any other. I still don't know if it was courage or surrender. Sometimes, in the evening, the wind brings sounds equal to the old machine motor choking. It might just be the grass drying in the sun, but my neck bristles. In those hours, I put the chalk on the blackboard and breathe deeply. I keep explaining multiplication as if nothing existed beyond numbers. When I pass through the gate on my way back, I first look at the sky, then at the boys, finally at the path. I try to convince my chest that this is enough. I doubt the fear ends. It just changes place. Maybe it lives now in the folds of memory, waiting for me to miss sewing. From time to time, I almost forget and catch myself measuring imaginary fabric with my fingers. The skin tingles where the scar lives. I remember the black explosion of the doll swollen with everything I lost. The machine doesn't come back. And if it comes back, who guarantees that the thread won't come alive from the first pass? If someday I resume sewing, I intend to do it in sunlight, in the patio, with people nearby, loud radio playing foro to scare away silence. Maybe I'll also keep a handful of common salt in a saucer, not to taste, but to remember that curiosity has a bitter taste. Until then, I teach, sweep, read simple stories, and pretend that the distant sound is just wind in the jatoba crown. And when night grows and fear pokes, I repeat softly, "You will not fear the night terror," not because I believe the phrase shields me, but because it's the only prayer I can make to hold the bar. My name is Isaac Gomez, and what I'm about to tell you happened over 20 years ago in a small town in rural Texas, not far from the Mexican border. Back then, I was young and reckless, always chasing the next party, the next good time. The problem was, all the best parties seemed to happen in neighboring towns, sometimes hours away. One particular Saturday night, my friend Carlos called me about a party in Brownsville. It was already past midnight, but I didn't care. I was feeling restless, and the thought of sitting at home made my skin crawl. The only problem was that Carlos had already left, and I had no ride. But that didn't stop me. I decided to walk the 15 miles back home along the old county road that cut through endless cornfields. The party was everything I'd hoped for: loud music, cold beer, and plenty of people to dance with. I lost track of time completely, and before I knew it, it was almost 2 in the morning. Most people were either passed out or heading home, so I figured it was time to make my own exit. The walk started out pleasant enough. The Texas night was warm but not suffocating, and there was enough moonlight to see the road clearly. I'd walked this route a few times before, usually during the day, so I knew there was an old abandoned farmhouse about halfway home. The place had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. Windows boarded up, yard overgrown with weeds, and a rusty chain-link fence surrounding the property. As I approached the farmhouse, something caught my eye. There, sitting on a large rock just outside the fence, was a small figure. As I got closer, I realized it was a child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. He was just sitting there in the middle of the night, completely alone. My first instinct was concern. What was a kid doing out here at this hour? Where were his parents? I quickened my pace and called out to him. "Hey there, buddy, you okay? What are you doing out here so late?" The boy didn't respond. He just sat there, perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I thought maybe he was scared or in shock, so I approached more carefully, speaking in a gentle tone. "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you. Are you lost? Do you need help finding your way home?" Still nothing. The kid didn't even turn his head to look at me. I was starting to get worried that something was seriously wrong. Maybe he was hurt or traumatized. I decided to walk around to get a better look at his face to see if he was okay. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. When I'd first seen the boy, he was sitting outside the fence, on a rock near the road. But now, as I looked at him again, he was in the exact same position, sitting with his legs crossed, hands resting on his knees. But he was inside the fence, at least 20 feet further back. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was seeing things. Too much beer, too little sleep. But no, he was definitely inside the fence now. The chain-link barrier was between us, and there was no way he could have gotten through it that quickly without me noticing. "This can't be right," I muttered to myself, rubbing my eyes. But when I looked again, the boy had moved even further back. He was now sitting near the front porch of the abandoned house, still in that same eerily perfect position. My heart started pounding. This wasn't natural. People don't just teleport like that. I watched him carefully, not wanting to blink, not wanting to look away for even a second. But I couldn't help it, my eyes watered, and I had to blink. In that split second, he moved again. Now he was sitting on the porch steps, even further away, but still in that exact same position. It was like watching a movie where someone kept cutting frames, making the subject jump from place to place. That's when I knew I had to get out of there. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It wasn't a lost child. It was something else entirely, something that didn't follow the rules of the natural world. I turned and started walking quickly toward home, but I could feel something behind me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw a tall, dark shadow moving through the cornfield, parallel to the road. It was keeping pace with me, but staying just out of clear sight among the stalks. The shadow was at least 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to glide rather than walk. I could hear the corn rustling as it moved, but its movements were too smooth, too fluid for something that size navigating through the dense crop. I started walking faster, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadow kept pace, sometimes disappearing completely behind the corn, then reappearing closer to the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was playing with me, like a cat toying with a mouse. "Get away from me," I shouted into the darkness. "I know what you are, and I'm not afraid of you. Leave me alone." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. I was terrified. My hands were shaking, and sweat was pouring down my face despite the cool night air. The shadow seemed to respond to my challenge. It emerged from the cornfield and stepped onto the road behind me. I could hear its footsteps now, not the normal sound of feet hitting pavement, but something else. Something that sounded like claws scraping against concrete. I broke into a run, pumping my legs as fast as they would go. The old county road had never seemed so long, and home had never felt so far away. Behind me, I could hear the thing giving chase, its footsteps getting closer and closer. Just when I thought it might catch me, I felt something ice cold touch my shoulder. The contact burned like dry ice, sending a shock of pain through my entire body. I screamed, and somehow found an extra burst of speed I didn't know I had. I could see the lights of my house in the distance now, and I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. My lungs felt like they were on fire, and my legs were screaming in protest, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't slow down. I reached my front door and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Behind me, I could hear heavy breathing and the sound of something pacing back and forth on my front lawn. Finally, I got the door open and burst inside, slamming it shut behind me and turning every lock I could find. My mother was waiting up for me, worry written all over her face. "Mijo, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before I could answer, something started pounding on the front door. Not knocking, pounding. The whole house shook with each impact, and I could hear the wood starting to crack. My father appeared in the hallway, his face pale with fear. He'd heard the commotion and grabbed a bottle of holy water from my mother's shrine. Without hesitation, he started sprinkling it around the door frame and windows, muttering prayers under his breath. The pounding continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The night became quiet again, except for the sound of our heavy breathing. None of us slept that night. We sat in the living room until sunrise, listening for any sign that the thing had returned. When morning came, my father and I went outside to check the property. The cornfield across from our house looked like a tornado had torn through it. Huge swaths of corn were burned and flattened, creating a path that led from the road all the way to the old farmhouse. The damage was so extensive that it made the local news, though they attributed it to unusual weather patterns. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. How could I? Who would believe me? But I learned something important that night. There are things in this world that we don't understand, things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, those things find you walking alone on a dark country road in the middle of the night. My name is Ryan, and what I am about to tell you happened several years ago, when a global crisis hit us with such devastating force that humanity was dragged into unprecedented chaos. At first, it seemed like something temporary, but soon the situation spiraled completely out of control. An unknown virus with unstoppable transmission infected and killed within days. The CDC was overwhelmed. Hospitals in Chicago and Detroit collapsed, and people began fighting for the most basic necessities: canned food, bottled water, and above all, survival itself. For me, the beginning of the crisis was an unexpected blow. I had been working as a mechanic in downtown Detroit, living paycheck to paycheck like so many others. I had heard about the pandemic on CNN and Fox News, of course, but like many Americans, I saw it as something distant, something that happened to other people in other places. However, when grocery stores began running out of supplies, when the subway stopped running, and FEMA imposed martial law, I knew nothing would ever be the same. That was when emergency shelters were activated throughout Michigan, places designated to offer protection to displaced citizens in crisis situations. The shelter where I ended up was not luxurious by any stretch, but it was better than the abandoned streets of Detroit. It was a converted apartment complex that the government had hastily equipped in the suburbs, about 30 miles from the city center. Isolated, yes, but supposedly safe, at least for a while. The entry process was long and bureaucratic. Health screenings were required, documentation proving you were not a threat to public safety, and above all, a cooperative attitude toward authority. At that moment, all I wanted was to feel secure again. So without questioning much, I went through the procedures and was granted access to what they called Shelter 7. The first impression of the place was one of complete disorganization. There were dozens of people crammed into hallways with makeshift sleeping areas, very little privacy, but the sensation of security initially made me feel calm. At first, the staff in charge of the shelter consisted of volunteers who mostly had no real experience in emergency management situations. They were ordinary citizens like me, people who had volunteered to help their fellow Americans. There were a few doctors and paramedics, but very few, and with extremely limited medical resources. The days began to pass slowly, with rationed meals of canned beans and government-issued MREs, and increasingly terrifying news broadcasts from the outside world. But soon I began to notice something deeply troubling. The shelter administrators, initially very kind and professional, began to show visible signs of stress and tension. The pressure of managing such a large group of desperate people without sufficient resources seemed to be breaking them down mentally. In particular, there was a woman named Melissa who was in charge of logistics and supply distribution. She went from being cordial and efficient to becoming a completely distant and visibly exhausted person. She was responsible for food and supply distribution, and at first, she seemed to be handling everything with relative calm and American efficiency. However, as the crisis intensified outside our walls, her behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. Food rations were beginning to run dangerously short, and fights over something as simple as an extra can of soup were becoming more frequent among the refugees. The first signs of serious tension among the displaced people did not take long to appear. People who had been friendly neighbors before began to look at each other with deep distrust, accusing each other of hoarding more than their fair share of resources. I remember one particular day when a man named Vincent, one of the few who seemed to have some informal authority among us, approached Melissa to discuss the distribution of the last remaining food boxes. His voice rose above the usual whisper, And although the discussion seemed to be just one of those routine disputes we had grown accustomed to, I could see something dangerous in Melissa's eyes. A barely contained fury, something primal she could no longer control properly. "This cannot continue like this, Vincent," Melissa said with a tense smile, but her hands were trembling uncontrollably. "There is not enough food for everyone here, and you know it perfectly well. But we still keep pretending everything is going to be fine." The tension did not end there that day. As days passed and resources continued to be depleted at an alarming rate, people became increasingly aggressive toward one another. I myself got involved in several small altercations over food distribution. But the worst incident came one afternoon when a small child, maybe 7 years old, fell seriously ill with a high fever. The few doctors remaining in the shelter were completely overwhelmed with cases, and medical equipment was so limited they could not properly attend to everyone who needed care. The child was isolated in a corner of the improvised medical wing, and Melissa made the controversial decision that he should not be treated until it was confirmed whether he was infected with the virus or suffering from something else entirely. Fearful looks crossed among the other refugees throughout the shelter. The atmosphere was becoming increasingly heavy and dangerous with each passing hour. The refugees began forming small protective groups, some defending Melissa and her administrative team, and others beginning to openly question her authority, suggesting that the leadership was making fundamentally wrong decisions that endangered everyone. Heated discussions turned into physical confrontations. Some nights you could hear screams and the sound of blows echoing from the hallways and common areas. It was not uncommon to see the volunteer security personnel patrolling the corridors with makeshift batons and baseball bats, desperately trying to control the escalating fights. But you could already sense that control was slipping completely out of their hands. One night, after a particularly long and stressful day, I was awakened by a tremendous crash coming from the main dining area. I ran there as quickly as I could, and what I witnessed was something I never could have imagined in my worst nightmares. A large group of people, including some of the most vulnerable residents in the shelter, had thrown themselves onto the food distribution table, grabbing packages and bags in an absolutely savage manner. People trying to defend what little food remained were attacking each other with their bare hands, fighting desperately to get what remained of the few available resources. Melissa, who until that moment had been trying to calm the chaotic situation, completely broke down emotionally. I watched her leave the room with unsteady steps, her gaze fixed on the floor in complete defeat. The screams continued echoing throughout the dining room, and I, who found myself in the middle of the chaos, realized something absolutely terrifying. None of us had any real control over what was happening anymore. It was not just food that was being disputed. It was something much deeper and more primitive. Fear, desperation, rage, all accumulated in the air like an invisible poison that was slowly killing our humanity. But that violent incident was just the beginning of our descent into madness. The next day, some refugees began to whisper about the possible outbreak of the virus inside the shelter itself. The sick child, whom we had discussed before, had died that night in the medical wing. No one knew for certain if he had been infected by the virus, but rumors began to spread like wildfire throughout the facility. A couple of other people began to suddenly fall ill with similar symptoms, and quickly the rumor spread that the entire shelter was now infected and contaminated. In just a few days, paralyzing fear took hold of everyone. Tensions grew exponentially throughout the building. Distrust between the various groups deepened into outright hostility. On a particularly rainy morning, one of the men from shelter security, Michael, burst into my small sleeping area. He was pale, sweating profusely, and his voice trembled with obvious terror. "Ryan, you have to come with me right now. Melissa has done something terrible," he told me, almost whispering as if afraid someone might overhear. I followed him quickly to the main dining room, and what I saw there chilled my blood to the bone. Melissa had locked several of the refugees in one of the back storage rooms, in what seemed like a desperate and completely irrational act of control. The reason, according to her increasingly unstable logic, was that some of them had been in too close contact with the sick child who had died. No one could approach those imprisoned people. No one could do anything to help them. As hours passed slowly, the situation continued to worsen dramatically. The shelter became a kind of improvised prison with arbitrary rules. Doors were secured with heavy padlocks and chains. Rooms filled with muffled whispers and barely audible screams of desperation. Food rations no longer arrived on any regular schedule, and what was once a place of refuge and safety became a battlefield where survival was the only rule. No one knew who to trust anymore. Everyone was a potential threat. And then, one morning, the absolute worst happened. The electrical power failed completely. Ventilation systems stopped working entirely, and the shelter, which before had seemed like a place of protection, became a hot and suffocating oven that trapped us all inside. People began to become more and more frantic with each passing hour. There was chaos in every corner of the building. Fear was palpable in the air, and screams echoed throughout the structure. It was at that moment, in the middle of complete desperation, that all semblance of civilized control vanished entirely. I do not know exactly how it happened, but at that moment, everyone seemed to be desperately looking for someone to blame. It did not matter if it was Melissa, the doctors, the volunteers, or even fellow refugees. In that shelter, we had all become enemies of each other, and although I tried to stay calm and rational, I knew the real monster was not outside threatening us. It was living among us, inside each of us. The shelter stopped being a place of refuge and safety. It became a condemnation, a living nightmare I still cannot forget to this day. The situation inside the shelter began to deteriorate with each passing hour. The complete lack of food, the tension from fear of contagion, and the total inability of those responsible to manage the chaos all accumulated in an explosive cocktail of violence. No one knew who to trust anymore, and suspicions overflowed everywhere like a toxic flood. Every conversation was filtered through paralyzing fear. Every look carried latent distrust and hostility. The hallways, which before had been common areas where we moved around normally, were now filled with isolated groups of suspicious people. Every corner seemed to be occupied by small clans of individuals, protecting each other mutually, fearful that someone would try to steal what little remained of food or basic supplies. There was no longer any legitimate authority, only pure chaos and anarchy. Melissa, the logistics manager, seemed to have completely lost her grip on reality. She was emotionally adrift, surrounded by her own overwhelming fear, unable to make any firm decisions about anything. As days passed, it became increasingly evident that her nerves were completely betraying her. She was no longer the competent woman who at first had seemed to have everything under professional control. Now she was completely overwhelmed, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes opaque, as if she were nothing more than an empty shell of her former self. When I found her one morning alone in the improvised office they had set up for her, she did not say a single word, just stared blankly through the window without really seeing anything at all. The lack of basic resources became more noticeable each time. The doctors, already completely exhausted and without any medications, began making increasingly desperate and questionable decisions. People who fell ill no longer received adequate medical attention, and those who simply showed signs of exhaustion were left aside as if they no longer mattered as human beings. Nights were long and torturous, and when sleep finally came, it was plagued with disturbing murmurs and violent starts. People did not sleep peacefully anymore. Fear was a specter that stalked us constantly from the shadows. The final drop that spilled the glass occurred 3 days after the complete power failure. Throughout that entire day, the shelter was immersed in a disturbing and unnatural silence. No one spoke to anyone, no one dared to approach others. People just moved through the building like ghosts, looking at others with deep distrust, as if we were all waiting for something absolutely terrible to happen. It was sometime during the night when it finally occurred. One of the groups that had formed a small security nucleus within the shelter, composed of men and women who had armed themselves with improvised weapons and tools, began circling the hallways trying to find a way to maintain some semblance of order. The problem was they no longer knew what order actually meant. There were persistent rumors that some of the weakest people in the shelter, those who looked sicker or more physically exhausted, were being considered a direct threat to the survival of others, as if contagion were something more than a simple disease. Some people began to whisper that if one of the infected individuals fell into the hands of the healthy ones, we would all end up being infected and dying. Fear of the unknown fed a paranoia that was completely out of rational control. At midnight, murmurs grew louder until they became blood-curdling screams. Someone had violently attacked a member of the security group, a man named Hunter, who at some point had been considered one of the most sensible and level-headed, but that night had completely exploded into violence. Somehow, his paranoia had led him to believe that the sick were an immediate and existential threat to everyone, and he began brutally hitting those who were already bedridden from fatigue or illness. "We cannot afford to have more infected people here," he repeated like a mantra. As violence unleashed throughout the shelter, the hallways filled with terrified screams and the sound of people running for their lives. It did not matter anymore who was actually sick or who was supposedly in charge. The only thing that mattered was surviving until the next day. The situation escalated quickly and brutally, and in less than an hour, most of the refugees were running through the building looking for the sick to isolate them, or worse. Everything became absolute chaos and madness. I tried to stay on the sidelines, observing what was happening with growing horror. I did not want to be part of that insanity, but at the same time, something deep inside me told me the situation had crossed a line from which there was no possible return. The refugees, already completely desperate, began making barricades with furniture and metal pieces. No one trusted anyone anymore. The security personnel, who before had been a stabilizing pillar of the shelter, became part of the problem rather than the solution. The screams of those trying to avoid being caught echoed throughout the entire place. That same night, things took an even darker and more sinister turn. Some of the refugees began seriously discussing the need to sacrifice some people to save others. A couple of men, those who had allied themselves with Hunter, began talking about purging the shelter as if it were a kind of necessary cleansing. No one dared to question their increasingly extreme words, because fear had penetrated so deep that everyone was terrified that those who spoke out would be the next targets. It was then that the shelter became something completely unrecognizable. People who before had shared living space peacefully began to separate, to isolate themselves from others. Each group began defending their small territory with an aggressiveness I had never witnessed before in my life. Discussions became physical fights. Fights became violent attacks. No one was safe anymore. And the worst thing was we no longer knew who the real enemies were. We had become our own monsters, our own worst nightmares. One dawn, when the shelter seemed to be immersed in thick and oppressive silence, something really terrifying happened. I witnessed two of the youngest volunteers, a couple of teenagers who, until that moment, had seemed to be handling the situation with relative calm, quickly leaving through the building's back emergency door. No one paid them much attention at first, until an hour later, a group of refugees began running toward us, screaming in absolute terror. "They are bringing death! They are bringing death!" they shouted with bulging eyes filled with pure horror. What happened next was something I cannot describe easily or without nightmares. The shelter, which was already a place of chaos and violence, transformed into a deadly trap. The back door had been opened by those two volunteers, and apparently they were bringing something terrible with them from the outside world. What we did not know was that they were transporting bodies of those who could no longer be saved, those who had already fallen to the contagion. But they brought them not as victims deserving respect, but as a kind of twisted offering, as if the shelter was now governed by a survival law in which only the strongest should be allowed to continue forward. The vision of those decomposing bodies, the way they dragged them through the hallways as if they were nothing more than objects, made the others explode in uncontrollable panic. Those who had been desperately looking for ways to survive now saw in every face a potential threat. And that realization was what ultimately destroyed us all. The last barrier, the one that had kept us united as human beings, crumbled brutally and completely. In the end, only one question tormented my mind day and night. Who had really won in this nightmare? Was there any winner at all in a situation like that? The people who had arrived at the shelter with genuine hope of surviving had fought desperately for their lives. But what we discovered there was infinitely worse than the external crisis itself. Desperation, fear, paranoia, and violence had destroyed everything we could once consider a civilized community. Humanity, in the end, was not capable of saving itself from its own darkness. My name is Esteban Andrade. I'm 24 years old, and I'm originally from Denver, Colorado. In 2023, upon finishing my degree in environmental management engineering at Colorado State University. I was assigned my social service at a forest camp in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, about 3 hours inland from Boulder, heading to an area known as Wolf Ridge. There operated a surveillance station under the National Forest Service in charge of monitoring fires, protected wildlife, and illegal logging. When they offered it to me, I was excited. I've always liked the mountains, nature, the cold air of the high country. I imagined 6 months full of hikes among pines, contact with animals, and real work. What I didn't imagine was running into a network that operates in the deepest part of the country, invisible to everyone's eyes, using the forest itself as a shield. What I'm going to tell you is completely real. It's not supernatural. There are no ghosts or lights in the sky. There's something more disturbing, organized, silent, and absolutely ruthless people. My first day was at the end of April. I went up in a 4-wheel drive truck with 2 other forest technicians, Don Aurelio, a veteran with more than 30 years in the mountains, and Ernesto, a young biologist who had been in the area for 2 years. On the way, they explained basic things to me. How to use the radio, how to identify heat spots, what to do if I encountered aggressive wildlife. What you should never do, kid, Don Aurelio told me as we descended a dusty path, is get involved where you're not called. Here there are trails that don't appear on any map. There are noises in the mountains that don't come from animals. And if you ever see armed people, you turn around. I thought he was exaggerating. Drug trafficking is something you know exists, of course, but I imagined it was far from forest life. I was wrong. The first weeks were quiet. I slept in a shared cabin with Ernesto. We took turns doing rounds, checking trail cameras, and recording deer, mountain lion, and lynx activity. Most days we walked between 6 and 9 miles. The mountains are beautiful in that area. Giant pines, icy rivers, and a clean silence that gives you peace. But soon I started noticing strange things. First were the distant shots. Some afternoons, while we were in remote areas, isolated detonations could be heard. Don Aurelio said they were illegal hunters, and we couldn't do anything if we didn't see them red-handed. But what was strange wasn't the sound, but the frequency. They were always at the same time and in the same areas, as if it were a pattern, not an accident. Then one night, returning to camp from a point called Deer Ravine, we found something that chilled my blood. A zigzag barbed wire freshly installed cutting the trail. It had no signage marks or belonged to the Forest Service. It curved around a canyon, and in the background you could see a dim light like a gas lamp deep in the mountains. Don Aurelio saw it, stopped, and said, "No, we're not going that way. It's a hot zone." I tried to ask more, but he didn't answer. One morning, while checking a trail camera near Stone Ridge area, I got ahead a few meters on a narrow trail. I was distracted taking a photo of what looked like a mountain lion print, when I heard a metallic click, like a weapon being readied. I turned slowly. There was a man standing among the trees. He carried an assault rifle, tactical pants, and a cap without insignia. He wasn't wearing a uniform, badge, or anything that identified him. He looked at me steadily, without moving. He didn't seem to have intention to shoot, but he didn't seem happy to see me either. "Good day, I'm from the Forest Service, Social Service," I said, the only thing that occurred to me. He didn't answer, just made a sign with his head indicating I should get lost. I went back over my steps. I ran into Ernesto, who was running when he heard the noise. I told him. He wasn't surprised. There are people taking care of other things in this area, Esteban. They're not here for the animals. He explained what no one tells you in university, that many parts of the mountains, especially in the northern area of Colorado, are controlled by armed groups that use the terrain to grow, hide weapons, or even set up laboratories. And they don't always disguise themselves. Sometimes they're there in broad daylight, as silent guardians of something we shouldn't see. The straw that broke the camel's back happened in my 4th month, in July. Don Aurelio had gone out alone that week. I was supposed to relieve him, but when the day came, he didn't return to camp. Ernesto and I started to worry. We called by radio several times. Nothing. Finally, we went to look for him. We knew his last location was Eagle Canyon, a site where the Forest Service hadn't entered since 2018. When we got there, we found his backpack beside a dry stream. Inside were his radio, his field notebook, and his knife. Everything perfectly placed. There were no signs of struggle, just a note folded in 4, written by hand. They're not taking care of animals, they're taking care of secrets. Don't come closer. We never found his body, we never found him. We reported it, of course, but everything was handled coldly. The authorities told us he probably got disoriented or had an accident. No formal search was organized. No one went up to investigate. 2 weeks later, Ernesto requested his discharge and left. I finished the service alone, with my heart in my throat every time I went to the field. I slept with a knife under the cot. I dreamed of the silhouette of the man with the rifle, of the note in the backpack, of the paths that didn't appear on maps. I finished my service in October of 2023. I went down in a supply truck without making noise. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, I just wanted to get out. To this day, I haven't talked about this with anyone outside the field. I continue working on environmental issues, but from an office. I haven't set foot in the mountains again. I also haven't found a single official mention of what happens in that area. But if you're reading this and thinking of doing your service in remote areas, do it. But stay alert. There are parts of the mountains where biologists don't rule, nor forest rangers, nor institutions, where wildlife isn't protected, but something that shouldn't be seen. And those who protect it don't wear uniforms or give explanations. Esteban Andrade, forest ranger for 6 months, survivor by luck. After coming down from the mountains, I thought I could leave everything behind. I acted as if nothing happened. I finished my social service report, presented my documents at CSU, and returned home with my parents in Denver. They knew something had changed me, though they never asked directly. My mom looked at me strangely. She cooked for me without saying anything, as if she intuited something had broken me up there. I tried to return to routine. I got a part-time job at a small environmental consulting firm, helping with impact evaluations for urban developments. Everything was cleaner, more controlled. An office with air conditioning, instant coffee, and Excel sheets. But nights gave me no respite. I dreamed of trails with no exit, of faceless men watching you from the pines, of trail cameras that returned images no one should have taken. The most disturbing thing wasn't the memories, but the feeling I was still being watched. One afternoon near Christmas, I received a strange message on my cell phone. It was from an unknown number. It had no text, just a photo. The image showed the camp from outside, the surveillance cabin, the water tank, the radio tower. There was mist, but I recognized it instantly. What was strange was that in the image you could see a human silhouette standing right in front of the door, back turned, with a backpack that looked like Don Aurelio's. I didn't respond. I blocked the number, but the discomfort stayed. Months passed. I forced myself to forget. Sometimes I thought maybe I had imagined it all. That stress, isolation, the pressure of being in a remote area had made me exaggerate. But deep down I knew it wasn't true. And I completely confirmed it the day Arturo Lopez looked for me, a forestry engineer who had done the same service as me a year before. We met at an environmental job fair in Fort Collins. He recognized me by the CSU badge and approached me. "You're Esteban, the one who was at Wolf Ridge?" I told him yes. I was also there in 2022. They took me out before time. He looked at me steadily. "You also saw the ones on the other side." I felt my stomach sink. He told me that once, while collecting soil samples near Eagle Overlook, he ran into a concrete structure among the trees, camouflaged with branches. It wasn't a cabin or shelter. It was an underground entrance with industrial ventilation. Before he could approach, he heard a shot in the air. He ran, reported it. Days later, they reassigned him to another area without explanations. The mountains are full of places that don't appear on any map. And it's not just for drugs, he told me. There are installations that aren't from narcos, they're from someone else, and those who take care of them don't identify themselves. That left me thinking. Weeks passed. I dared to search in Reddit forums and closed Facebook groups about rural experiences in red zones. Most were nonsense, but I found 2 publications that chilled my blood. One of them talked about a communications base buried in the Colorado mountains, built in the 70s and abandoned after a project by the old Federal Communications Commission. Supposedly, it was converted into a custody point for certain private projects of federal interest, without more detail. The other publication said Wolf Ridge was a buffer zone, an area used not just for production, but to shelter movements that shouldn't be detected by satellite. What I saw there, the erased cameras, the armed men who didn't hunt, the shots in sequence, began to take on new meaning. In April of the following year, I decided to return. Not to stay, but to see with my own eyes if something was still there. I asked a friend from college, Martin, to accompany me. He knew the region well and had relatives in a nearby community, Copper Creek, from where we could rent a mule and go up a trail that reached near the old camp. We planned the trip carefully. We carried GPS, cameras, provisions, nothing with drones or flashy technology. We went discreet. We went up at dawn. At noon, we reached an area known as Aspen Grove, less than a mile from the point where Don Aurelio disappeared. Martin was the first to notice there were new towers. In the distance, on a hill that previously had nothing, 2 metal structures with antennas pointing toward the sky rose up. They weren't rural telecommunications, that was obvious. There were also high-tension cables going down the slope, partially buried. We approached cautiously. There were no formal roads, but the footprints in the earth were recent. Boot prints, not hikers, at least 4 different pairs. We decided not to continue. We returned to Copper Creek without telling anyone what we saw. Martin asked me not to mention it. He swore he would never go up again, and I haven't done it since then either. Today I work at an environmental NGO. I do field work, but in areas where people send greetings and share coffee, not where shots mark the clock. What I learned in the mountains doesn't have to do with pines or conservation. It has to do with state limits, with map voids, with secrets hidden on nameless trails. It taught me there are areas where you enter only once and leave, if you're lucky, with a loaded mind and tied tongue. That's why I write it here, because if someday I disappear again, I don't want them to say it was an accident. I want them to remember someone had already told it, and that in the Colorado mountains not everything that's protected walks on four legs. Esteban Andrade, ex-forest ranger, citizen as far as they let me. My name is Javier, and I work on a fairly isolated farm located on the outskirts of a small town in the highlands of Colorado. This type of night work isn't something I enjoy, but sometimes circumstances force me. The farm belongs to an older man, Mr. Manuel, who generally prefers that work be done at night, so as not to interrupt his daytime routine. I'm just an employee who does what he can to stay afloat, and I don't usually question much of what they ask me to do. However, there's something that since that night I haven't been able to stop thinking about. It was a cold autumn night when Mr. Manuel asked me to finish some urgent work in the barn. He told me I needed to repair some roof structures that had been damaged by recent rains, and that it couldn't wait until the next day. He liked everything to be in perfect order. So I got in the truck and drove to the farm to complete the task despite the hour. It was already late when I arrived, and the wind was blowing hard through the trees, as if the earth itself were complaining about the cold. When I reached the barn, darkness quickly enveloped me. The truck's light barely illuminated the surrounding area, and the old barn structure seemed even more somber, with the shadows cast by the beams and tools I had left around. Despite being accustomed to working in such conditions, something that night made me uncomfortable. The feeling of being alone in the field was heavy, almost oppressive. I thought it was just fatigue and cold, but the sensation wouldn't go away. I began climbing to the roof with the necessary tools for the repair. As I progressed in my task, I heard the characteristic sounds of the farm, the creaking of the barn's wood, the distant howl of some coyote, and the murmur of wind slipping through the gaps. However, while I was concentrating on the repair, something made me stop. I felt a presence, a strange sensation, as if someone were watching me. I didn't pay much attention at first, attributing it to my tired mind, but as the minutes passed, the feeling of discomfort grew. I looked in all directions but saw nothing. The only light I had was from the lamp I had left on the ground, which swayed faintly due to the wind. I decided to continue working, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, I heard a slight noise coming from inside the barn, something like a whisper or movement, but it wasn't the wind or any animal. It was a more human sound, something subtle but present. I turned quickly, hoping to find some trapped animal or something that might have caused the noise, but the barn was empty. At that moment, something made me look toward the barn window. From the darkness extending beyond the lamp, I saw a figure in the corner, barely visible in the gloom. The silhouette was diffuse, but clearly someone or something was there. My heart beat hard and my body tensed. I couldn't distinguish if it was a person or something else, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I took my flashlight and headed toward the door, trying to approach calmly, but as I did, the figure disappeared. I remained silent, trying to understand what I had seen, and the cold chilled me to the bone. I supposed maybe it had been my imagination, or that the wind had moved some shadow. After all, the barn was in poor condition, and air currents could create strange effects with the light. But as I returned to my work, something made me look toward the window once more. This time, the figure wasn't there. However, something else caught my attention, an old portrait hanging on the wall, almost imperceptible, covered by dust. I had seen it before, but had never stopped to observe it carefully. It was a black and white photo of an austere-looking family with old clothes and serious faces. The family was gathered in front of what appeared to be this same barn, and one of the men in the photo seemed familiar to me. It was Mr. Manuel, young, though with a much more somber expression. A chill ran down my back, but I decided not to give it more importance and focus on my work. However, as I continued repairing the roof, I felt a growing weight in the air, as if something were about to happen. It was then that I heard a dull thud, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor inside the barn. I decided to investigate. I could no longer ignore that feeling that someone was there watching me. I came down from the roof cautiously and headed inside. When I entered, I saw that one of the tools had fallen to the floor, but as I picked it up, something caught my attention. In a corner of the barn, there was a small trapdoor I had never noticed before. It was hidden by a pile of old stacked wood and accumulated dust. The thud I had heard came from that area. Without thinking too much about it, I approached and opened it. Below the trapdoor was a ladder that descended to a dark passageway. Something compelled me to go down, as if an invisible force were calling me from below. I decided to follow my impulse and began to descend slowly. The air was colder down there, and the silence was overwhelming. My flashlight light barely illuminated the space, but enough to realize the place didn't seem to have been touched in a long time. At the bottom, I found a small underground room with stone walls and a wooden table covered by old papers. As I approached, I saw there were several documents, but what caught my attention most was a notebook in which someone had written by hand with hurried handwriting. I began to read the first pages, and at first the accounts seemed simple stories about life on the farm, harvests, animals. But as I turned the pages, the writing became more disturbing. They spoke of voices in the night, of figures lurking in the darkness, and of the death of several people related to the farm. At the end, the notebook mentioned something even stranger, a legend about an ancient pact between the farm's founders and an unknown entity, a force that demanded sacrifices in exchange for protection. It was then that I understood the figure I had seen in the barn wasn't a human being or a specter, but something that had been waiting, watching as part of an ancient pact. The notebook revealed that every worker who had passed through the farm over the years had disappeared under strange circumstances. I felt like reality was crumbling around me. Was I the next one? The feeling of being watched was no longer just paranoia. It was a real presence, something that had been there for generations. I quickly left the basement, and from that night, I never returned to the farm. I could never get out of my head what I discovered in that notebook and what I had seen in that room. Sometimes, when night falls over the Colorado highlands, I can still hear in the stillness of darkness the echo of those steps I will never follow again. I I never thought my story would ever have a place in a paranormal podcast, and I've been listening to these shows since they started. It's good that those of us who work in the streets, at stands, in small restaurants, also have the opportunity to share these things that happen to us. And this happened to me in broad daylight, on a Friday, around 9:30 in the morning. I have a small restaurant serving traditional stewed dishes outside my house. And as many know, I keep the pots outside on the sidewalk to serve customers faster and take the food to their tables. That morning I was arranging the stews when I saw an old man approaching, a very old man, really. He walked slowly, hunched over. He stopped in front of me and said in a soft voice, "Can you serve me?" I smiled and said, "Of course, please come in." I helped him down the small step at the entrance because I didn't want to see him trip. I even took his arm and led him to a table inside the restaurant. "Wait just a moment," I told him. "I'll prepare it for you." I went out to the sidewalk, served his order as always, and when I turned around to take it to him, he was gone. The man had disappeared just like that, from one second to the next. I looked at the street thinking maybe he'd left without saying anything, but no. Only the neighbors were there. I went into the restaurant's bathroom, which is the only place where someone could hide, but he wasn't there either. Then I started getting a bad feeling, like emptiness. I even went into my house thinking that maybe in his confusion he'd gone through the wrong door. But no. There was nobody and no trace of that old man. To this day I don't know what it was. I don't know who it was. But I saw him, I touched him. I helped him sit down, I talked to him, and he disappeared. Every time I remember that moment, I get goosebumps. Because I don't think that person was alive. It was a ghost. Thank you for giving us this space. Sometimes we think strange things only happen at night, on highways, or in cemeteries, but they also happen in broad daylight. I'm Jacob, a simple man of few words, accustomed to working whatever was necessary to get ahead. Life never gave me many luxuries, but I always knew how to manage. Until by chance I arrived at this farm on the outskirts of a town forgotten by almost everyone in rural Nebraska. I was looking for something stable, a job that would allow me to be away from the city, and I found the offer to be a farm caretaker. They told me about a secluded field, surrounded by forests and rolling hills, where fruits and vegetables were grown, and they needed someone to watch over the crops, especially at night. The owner, an older man named Mr. Vincent, looked tired from age and routine, and the place seemed perfect for living quietly and forgetting about the hustle and bustle of everyday life. I couldn't imagine what awaited me. My first day on the farm was like any other on an isolated estate. Mr. Vincent showed me the facilities, the warehouse, the gardens, and the small cabin that would be my home for the next few months. He gave me the keys and explained the basics about the crops. The farm was on extensive terrain, surrounded by low hills and thick trees that rose like sleeping giants covered by morning mist. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh grass, and the sound of birds was the only music heard in the morning. Collect what you can during the day and make sure to check the crops when night falls. There are some areas where the harvest grows quickly and other places that need more time, Mr. Vincent told me with his raspy voice. Days passed and the routine was peaceful. I would wake at dawn, check the harvests, and feed the animals. There wasn't much to do during daylight hours, so I dedicated myself to repairing fences, cleaning the barn, and some other minor tasks. But soon, I began to notice something strange. At first, they were just small inconsistencies. A cucumber that appeared on a plant I hadn't seen the night before, or a row of tomatoes that seemed to have arranged itself. I thought maybe I had been distracted or had forgotten to see some things. But the feeling of being watched began to make me think something wasn't right. What really worried me were the tracks. One afternoon, while checking a cornfield, I saw some marks on the ground. It wasn't unusual to see animal tracks, but these were different. They didn't belong to any animal I had seen around there. They were large tracks, like something that walked on two legs, but they weren't human. The outline of the tracks was blurry, as if something with fur or skin had left a strange mark on the ground. I thought of some wild animal, maybe a mountain lion or bear, but the tracks didn't match anything I had seen in the area. Each night, after making my rounds through the crops, I checked the tracks. I did it cautiously, as if I expected to find something that would give me an answer. But every time I returned, the tracks seemed to have moved away or faded a bit more. I wondered if I was losing my sanity from the solitude, or if it was some joke from a neighbor. But the tracks were too clear to ignore. One night, I decided to stay longer in the field, hidden among the corn crops. I wanted to see what really happened while darkness took over the farm. At first, the silence was total, as if everything were asleep. But as time passed, I began to hear something, a slight creaking, as if someone were walking among the plants, but without making noise. The air was cold, and fog began to cover the ground, making everything blurry and dark. Then I saw it. In the distance, among the shadows of the trees, something was moving. It was a tall figure with a thin silhouette that moved among the crops without making the slightest sound. Its movement was fluid, as if it floated over the ground, and every time its feet touched the earth, the plants moved slightly, as if they were being pushed aside. My heart began to beat faster, and an uncomfortable sensation ran down my spine. What was that? An animal or something else? I remained motionless, hoping the figure would disappear, but instead it began to approach me. I felt an impulse to get up and run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off that figure that was slowly approaching, as if it were studying every corner of the field. In the end, it disappeared into the fog without a trace. When the sun began to peek over the horizon, I felt more relieved, but also more confused. What had I seen? Had it been real, or was my mind simply playing a bad trick on me from the solitude? The worst came later. That night, while making my rounds, something even more disturbing happened. The corn crops I had checked in the morning were empty. There wasn't a single ear on the plants. At first I thought it had been some animal, but then I remembered what I had seen the night before. The plants weren't just empty, but they were perfectly arranged, as if something had stripped them of the harvest in a precise and meticulous way. I couldn't find any animal tracks around, only those strange marks that appeared suddenly. Desperate, I told Mr. Vincent about all this when I saw him the next morning. His face, always grave, darkened a bit more. That has happened before, but no one knows what causes it, he told me in a low voice. There are those who say it's the wind or animals, but I've seen strange things on that farm, and sometimes answers aren't given by human eyes, but by what we feel in our stomach. What happens on that land isn't normal. That was the last time I spoke with him. Mr. Vincent didn't return to the farm for weeks. No one saw him anymore, and I was left there facing something I didn't understand, but that felt too real. The harvests continued disappearing, and the tracks kept appearing in the fields, always closer to the house. I never saw that figure in the fog again, but the tracks, the crops that harvested themselves, and the shadows in the field continued being part of my daily life. I left the farm after a month without ever knowing what really happened. No one else in town dared to talk about the subject, but from time to time, when I pass by there, I can swear I still see those tracks on the ground and hear the distant creaking of something moving in the darkness. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.